Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Nancy Stokes. I actually know most of you, but I just met Denise and Jim. They're sitting in the back there. They are friends of Doug's. And we have some people from MCC here today. So I'm just very happy to see everyone who came out on this rainy day to learn about Satan. Everything you really didn't know you needed to know, but here we are. So the first thing that I would like to say is that I am not a religious scholar. I love to do research, and that's how I actually came up to doing this program today. I read The Origin of Satan by Dr. Pagels quite a while ago, and then I read it again in the spring of this year, and I wasn't teaching a class or anything, so I thought, well, this is so fascinating, at least to me, fascinating and quite entertaining. And I thought, well, I think let me just do something about it. So for 5 months, I have been cavorting about with Satan, okay? In my consciousness, reading, putting my notes together, and this PowerPoint. So I'm really glad today is now we're done. I'll be done by this afternoon. So what I'm presenting is the work of Dr. Pagels and also Dr. Rocco Errico. So these are really not my words. So I am sharing with you their research. So that's my disclaimer basically, is that if you've got a beef with anything I say, you're going to have to contact Dr. Pagels or Dr. Errico, because these are their research ideas. So a little housekeeping. If you wouldn't mind putting your phones on silent, that would be great, so they don't disturb. So your rock and roll music from somebody that you know calling you will disrupt the class. Also, bathrooms are this way through this door, or you can go downstairs through the back doors. Is everybody comfy? Too hot, too cold? Jan's already too cold, but she brought a coat.
Could I ask a favor? Could you dim those lights? They're just blaring.
Okay, she can do it a little tiny bit.
Yeah.
Does that help? Jean?
Yes.
Does that help a bit?
Yeah, get that.
Oh, good. Okay. All right, that's great. But other than that, everybody's comfortable? And can everybody see this? Okay. We will be taking some short breaks. We'll take a break for lunch. And also, I don't mind if you have a question or comment, if you just want to, stick it up there while I'm talking, because I'm not going to say after 2 or 3 hours of speaking, okay, anybody got any questions? No. Especially if it was from the first hour. So I actually would prefer that you just, hey, I have a question about that or comment or whatever. And I'll do my best to answer that. We will take probably about a half hour for lunch. Come on in. A half hour for lunch, and then we would meet back, in this room for the last part. I've actually slashed and burned this twice. Oh, are you looking for AA?
No, I am in AA. I wanted to pay our rent.
Oh, here.
Oh. Okay. I thought I saw you come up the sidewalk. Well, she knows what that means. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you. Thank you. So, as I was saying, I slashed and burned this because the first time I started rehearsing it with myself, it took me 2 hours to do the first introduction. So I said no. So I've done that twice. So I hope that this will be a reasonable amount of time. If I see people looking at their clocks or yawning, well, then I'll know that I need to move it along even more. So, because I don't want to bore you. Really, I read this book twice, found it fascinating. Don't know if you will or not. So we'll see how many people I lose after lunch. Okay, so let me just talk about Dr. Pagels and Dr. Errico for just a couple of minutes, just so that you all know. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Pagels and her work, The Gnostic Gospels? Okay, great. So Dr. Pagels actually got her PhD and started teaching right away, and she's considered to be one of the experts on early Christianity. And she actually has been teaching at Princeton in the religion department since 1982. She knows Greek, Latin, German, Hebrew, French, Italian, and Coptic. She learned all of those so that she could read scripture in its original language. I personally find her completely amazing. In 1979, she wrote the book, The Gnostic Gospels, which is a brief analysis of the materials that were found at Nag Hammadi, which of course is Upper Egypt. They found those scriptures in 1945, and she was given access to all of them. So that was where the Gnostic Gospels book came from. Then she had a couple of personal tragedies in her life, which spurred her on to seeking more spiritual awareness. And as she was doing that, somehow that ended up with this, The Origin of Satan. Anyway, she's written many other books. And if you enjoy this today, you definitely should check out all of her books. She's an amazing writer. Dr. Rocco Errico, I have just one of his books, Let There Be Light. He is the nation's leading biblical scholar working from the original Aramaic Peshitta. He worked with Dr. George Lamsa, who is a renowned Assyrian biblical scholar who actually translated the Bible from the Near Eastern text, which would be Aramaic, which was the language Jesus spoke. And actually, in Dr. Lamsa's family, because of where he lived, they also spoke Aramaic, so he grew up speaking it. And Rocco Errico studied with him for many years as his student. But Let There Be Light is a book that if you have any interest in the Bible, everybody needs to read. And I'm going to talk about why as I get further down in there. So let's just get going here. So that's the introduction. This is one of the most important things that you will learn here today. This is from Dr. Rocco Errico. The Bible and the New Testament, and the Hebrew Bible also, was written for us today in 2022, but not to us when it was written. Okay, because it was written to a Near Eastern audience. Dr. Rocco Errico says that Jesus was really funny. He had a great sense of humor. But we don't get it because we don't understand what is actually written. I'm going to tell you why here in just a minute. But anyway, so does that make sense to everybody? Written to us, but not written for us, but not to us, because we can glean anything we need spiritually from the Bible today. But if we didn't live back then, we don't get the jokes, right? We just don't get it. So that's why it's very important. Actually, I also say to read Dr. Rocco Errico because he would help us understand that. So I'm just going to start with the word. That's not right. Why is that there? That is, well, let's not even go there yet. How did that go away? Oh, now you see, I slashed and burned and then didn't note that. Okay, we're going to go to Satan here in just a minute. But first I want to start with angel. The word angel, and we're going to start with angel because why? Every single person in this room heard that Satan was what? A fallen angel. That God threw him out of heaven, and Michael, the archangel, is fighting him tooth and nail, and all of that. So we've all heard that. So the word angel, Dr. Errico says, was actually a bad translation. It's from the Greek, which is the word malacha, which means a messenger. So angels are messengers, but he says that's still a bad translation. So, because angels don't have wings, there's actually nowhere in the Bible that it says that God created angels. That was kind of shocking to me. I just didn't know that. That's from Dr. Errico. He says, but in Psalms it says that angels are God's spirit. But really, he says that wherever you see the word angel, you should just put the word messenger. There's a messenger that comes to the person in the story in the Bible. Even if you get some vision, you may actually see an angel with wings, because you certainly can do that. But in reality, it is a messenger. Wings represent to the Near Eastern people, I'm everywhere. I'm going to dominate. I can go anywhere. You know, you can't walk around in heaven. You have to have wings. Right? Otherwise, you'll fall through the clouds. At least that's what I thought as a child. So the Assyrians actually even have a bull that has a human face, and a beard, believe it or not, armor and big wings, which meant I'm dominating this entire area, and great expansion. So wings just mean great expansion, and I can be everywhere now. So all the people in the Bible who are seeing angels are either in a dreaming state or they're in a trance, which would be the prophets. We hear lots from the prophets. So he says that all good people doing good things representing God, we call them angels. So, but Rocco Errico says that there is no such thing philosophically or historically, an angel with wings. That's according to Rocco Errico. If you have a problem with that, you just email him or call him up. But it is how we want to take that. Because if you want to see angels with wings, I mean, I have 8 pictures of angels in my house on my wall. They're very, it's actually a comforting image, actually. So he says, like in Peter, he says an angel did not let Peter out of prison when he was imprisoned. It was a man snuck in and got him out. But he was considered, somebody does something and you go, oh, you're such an angel. It was like that. Oh, you're such an angel. But that is not to be taken literally. So with Dr. Rocco Errico, if you really want to understand the Bible, here's the thing. You have to look at it through the Semitic context of culture, language, the idioms that they use, symbolism, mystical style, psychology, and my favorite, literary amplification, which means they exaggerate like anything. I mean, and you have to look at that and to see. And anyway, I just think that's fascinating. So just to give you an example, some oft used phrases in the Bible you may see. In 2 Peter, I just have a few examples. Cast them down into hell. That is a metaphor for let them stew in their own juices. Basically, you made your bed, now you have to lie in it. That's really what that means, and it's your own fault. Hell is a metaphor for torment, regret, turning from the truth, and now you're paying the price for it. So that's actually what the word hell actually means. And the word sin means missing the mark. I call it self-inflicted nonsense. S-I-N. She didn't write that, I'm just telling you. Okay, to everyone's favorite, Isaiah 14. Now Isaiah, I actually love Isaiah. I think it's just so interesting. But he actually foresaw the fall of Babylon long before it happened in 538 BC. So this sentence, how have you fallen from heaven, is an Aramaic idiom that means, how did you lose your power and influence, O king of Persia? And the morning star that's in that sentence, the word Lucifer should never have been capitalized because it's not anybody's name. There is no such thing as a fallen angel in this context, or a star, or a character, or a person named Lucifer. So it should never have been capitalized with a capital L, because it is not a person. And many people do quote that to show somehow, but it has nothing to do with anything but the fall of Babylon, and it's Isaiah who is foreseeing that. So I thought that was fascinating. Rocco Errico says that we created a creature that does not exist. So here's the word Satan. It comes from Sata. The Aramaic root of that is Sata, which means to mislead, go astray, miss the mark. The Hebrew root is Sitna or Satana, which just means adversity. So the first century Jewish groups, including the Essenes, right, and the followers of Jesus, actually gave central importance to Satan, characterizing Jesus' ministry actually as a struggle between God and Satan. So now we got 2 kingdoms fighting against each other. So basically Satan is invoked to express human conflict and to characterize human enemies within the religious traditions. The ancient worldview is very interesting. This comes from an anthropologist, Robert Redfield, who says that, especially in the ancient times, I honestly think it's still well alive today, there's us and them. We're the humans, they are all the non-humans. Okay, even the word Egyptian means human. So if you are an Egyptian, you are human. If you are not an Egyptian, you are not. That's the us and them that they went with. Of course, the Greek word for a non-Greek person is a barbarian, subhuman. You might be human, but you're not really as human as we are because we're Greek. For the Jews, all people who were not Jewish were called Gentiles. For the early Christians, well, and also the Jews also said, we are God's people and you are not. The early Christians took on that and said, well, we're God's people and you are not. And all others are considered enemies of God. If you are an other, you are a devil. So, and actually you can see this in all four Gospels. And unless you really just get really down in there, a lot of this stuff that she's pointing out, you don't even notice. I mean, it's really pretty deep. So, really, the moral implications and interpretations. Oh wait, no, let me do this one next. Okay, so the bigger part of this book really is about how the early Christians, and it wasn't even really early. Actually, it goes way into the centuries. I mean, the Crusades lasted 500 years. The Christians demonized the Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. The Christians demonized the pagans, or the Gentiles, at some point, and then they demonized themselves, their own members, and that's what they're the heretics. We've all heard that word, and we know what that means. So, her book is actually really showing that, and she says that their moral interpretation of conflict justified this hatred, even mass murder, which was the Crusades. The Crusades began in Jerusalem because they wanted to take back the area that under Islamic rule, but then it ended in the 16th century. So we're talking about 500 years. Not because the Muslims weren't a threat, but because the Protestants just had no use for the Crusades anymore, and they weren't going to give money towards that end. And of course, in the 16th century, I'm going to talk about Martin Luther as the Protestant Reformation got going. So just want to remind you, the earliest Gospel of Mark was written about 10 years, a generation, after Jesus left the planet. And the other ones were written nearly 2 generations later. I have to say that when I took my first New Testament class, she's laughing. She's laughing because she knows. I almost fell off of my chair when I said, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not walking around with their iPads. But, okay, now, what was that ask? Jesus, what was that ask? And you should, what? Say that again. That's a really good line. I want to write that down. That's really good. No, they were not. That was shocking to me. I was just like, what? So as a child, I'm thinking they're following Jesus around and somebody's taking notes. Even if it's on a papyrus. Somehow, they are writing it all down. But they didn't. So, to me, that's just a whole big book of, I don't know. So anyway, basically what she's saying is that each evangelist wanted to strengthen the solidarity among the Jesus group that they were with, and also because as the split between Christians and Jews just kept growing wider and wider. Anybody got any questions just about that little introduction piece there?
Don't have a question, but could you fix your mic because it keeps cutting?
Is it doing something funny? Oh,
Now talk.
okay.
That's better.
Oh, okay, so what, it's too far down?
Yes.
It's down there.
Thank you.
Okay, so nobody can hear the first part. Great, thanks, Jan.
Yeah, you got to repeat it.
Oh, no, I would never, now I can hear myself. Okay, it was,
No, recorded. It just wasn't. I couldn't hear it as loud as.
okay. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark and the Jewish War. There were several Jewish wars, but we're going to talk about the first one, which was, you have to just know the whole history really here is that Palestine and that whole area was conquered by so many, it's like everybody, right? So they're always under some threat of somebody. But in 66 CE, which is about 35 years after Jesus was left the planet, there was the first Jewish war. So this is Josephus. The reason his picture is up here is because I just thought he was dressed so pretty. I just love his turban. It's just lovely. The colors are just fabulous. So he was a Roman historian, and so a lot of the information that we even have about early Christianity comes from his writings. So we've got the biblical account of whatever, but then we have an actual historical account of what was happening at the time. So he wrote the first Jewish-Roman war, and that included the siege of Masada. I don't know if any of you know about that. There's a movie on that. It was just wonderful. Sad though, because they all got killed. Apparently the Romans were extremely, they were just brutal with that. So the historians have gotten lots of insight from this guy Josephus. So his account of the war survived, actually. Otherwise, nobody would even know about this first war. The priests were working for peace. There were revolutionaries all over the countryside, and there were a bunch of prominent men of Israel, of Jerusalem, who wanted to maintain power because they didn't like all the regular people that lived out in the country, right? They just wanted to separate themselves from that. Unfortunately, the soldiers sacked the great temple, burned it to the ground, made sacrifices to their own gods in the temple, raped, pillaged, and plundered. They don't show you that when you watch TV and you see things about Roman soldiers. Why is Pagels interested in this war? Because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are wartime literature. Because when Jesus is around, the Romans were in charge. When the Gospels were being written hundreds of years later, also, Romans still in charge. So she says wartime literature was one of the main things that actually has something to do with what they were writing about and why. They think that Mark was really a friend of Peter's, but really nobody really knows, definitely. But Mark was just not, a casual observer. He actually took sides. So she says the way he presented the story really was that there was a charismatic Jewish teacher 35 years earlier who had been executed by Pontius Pilate on charges of sedition against Rome. That was really sort of the gist of that. Other people wrote about Jesus and his followers also. Of course, Josephus is one of those people who wrote about it. Wrote about physically the crucifixion and about Jesus and his followers, but he was writing about them with great hostility and contempt. Nobody liked them because they were making trouble and nobody wanted to hear it. So after the war, the priestly class completely lost power. The Jews are scattered. Jesus' followers became more and more disconnected from the Jewish community. Then they refused to fight in the war. Why? Because Jesus was coming back soon. The end is near. Now that made the other Jewish people really mad. Because they're like, no, come on, this is happening now. But Jesus' followers, they just refused to engage in that. And they also said that the horrors of this war were caused by God being angry for rejecting the Messiah that he already sent. Convenient explanation. So Mark wants to keep the Romans at bay. And he wanted to focus his conflict in the Jewish community and not that the Romans were really doing too much because, they just come get you and just haul you away. So he did not want to do that. Now here is Pontius Pilate, right? He was a governor in Palestine for many years, and Mark's description of him makes him sound like Mary Poppins compared to who he really was. Because Josephus and other writers said that he was the most brutal governor that Palestine had. That he was ruthless, he was stubborn, he was cruel, and he also just chopped people's heads off with no trial. Just didn't do it. So that's an interesting thing. But the thing is that Mark did not want to raise the Romans' ire. He did not want them to get mad enough to come find him. So basically, Mark is placing the struggle within the context of Rome, but actually it's more complicated because it's actually between good and evil. That is the bigger picture that he's trying to pose there. But placing Jesus and his followers in the struggle with Satan actually minimizes the whole thing with the Romans. And it places increasing blame actually on Jesus' Jewish enemies. So Dr. Pagel says that actually Satan actually really rarely appears in the gospel accounts, but he plays a central role. Like we know, Jesus in the desert, although Jesus in the desert was not in every single gospel, especially John. He puts a whole new spin on that thing. And then Judas, of course. But according to Pagels, I don't know if you would believe this or not, but she says that the writers actually consciously realized that the whole story of Jesus and his followers would make no sense without Satan, without the antagonist. Now, what I want to know is, don't you know who the real enemy is? I mean, who's stringing up all of the Jews? The Romans. They did not want to do that. They did not want to show that. Okay, is this... Let me just scrunch it to my ear here. Okay, so she says Mark is not really writing the history of Jesus. He actually wants to show the eschatological life of Jesus, which is referring to death, what's going to happen at death, at the judgment, and the final destination of the soul. It's not really so much historical. So, how was Satan actually characterized? Almost never about a Roman. It was Jesus' Jewish enemies, Judas, chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, anybody in their own group that did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Those were the people who Satan was characterized as, but not the Romans. So here's the actual enemy. This is a woodcut of the Romans just crucifying thousands of Jews. They would just go out and find anybody that's not following the governor's laws, and they would just string them up. Some went to trial, some would not. Didn't matter. But the gospel writers were actually keeping themselves separate from the majority of the Jews in their community, especially those who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay, so here's kind of what it looks like physically. Here are the Jews who live in Palestine and all around the area. Okay, here they are. Huge group, right? Here's Jesus' followers in the middle of that group. Jews, Jesus' followers. It's minute. It's like the head of a pin. It's that. We're talking about 20 people. 30 people maybe at the most. Right? Maybe this many. I don't know. But it was tiny. And Pagels is pointing that out. That actually there were hardly any people who really objected to what they were doing and what the Jewish community was doing, or that they actually believed that Jesus was the Messiah. It was very tiny. Jesus doing miracles, oh my gosh, really made the Jewish leaders really mad, especially when he forgave people in public and he did miracles in public. It made them so mad. But what happens is that Jesus' followers are now calling the Jewish leaders agents of evil. So Luke and John, who write the latest, right, getting up towards 100, they state explicitly that Jesus' opponents were energized by Satan, when Mark actually only implies it. So you have to just remember, in the timeline, we've got Jesus over here, and there's Mark a little bit later, and then we got Matthew a little bit later, and then we got Luke and John way over here at 100, right? So 65 years after Jesus left the planet. How they could remember what Jesus said, I have no idea. They have better memory than I do. So really the takeaway from this is that Satan is really the source of the conflict within the Jewish community, but it's not coming from out there. It is all happening within. Any questions at all? You're either sleeping I'm telling you everything you need to know, and there's just no questions out there. Okay, I don't care. If there's no questions, that's fine. Okay, now we're going to go back in time. Okay, now we're going to go back to Abraham and Moses and way back. Because honestly, it's actually quite different in earlier Jewish tradition about what this Satan character really is. So, this is a little picture, which you probably can't really see, of the Babylonian exile. That's someone's painting and someone's rendition of that. So, during the Babylonian exile, there were lots and lots of people. I mean, that was far. I mean, even if it rolled itself 1 mile, come on, really? But anyway, so now the Jewish leaders are now in Babylon. There's no temple. There's nothing to do. So even on a Friday and a Saturday night, on date night, they are working. There's nothing to do. They can't even go to temple because it doesn't exist. They were not allowed to engage in their religious culture. So they wrote the Bible to unify the Jewish people who are now spread all over the place. However, there were other writings that they did not allow within the Hebrew Bible, and those are called apocryphal, which mean hidden things that might be true, but we're not really sure. And then pseudepigraphal things are downright false writings. That's a fun word to say, pseudepigraphal. I'll just stand in front of the mirror and say it 10 times. That's such a fun word. Okay, so they didn't just let any writings in, it was their own writings, and they definitely better not be the false ones. So way back with Abraham, we've got us and them. Us, the people of God, are human, them, the other. Whenever you see the word the nations in the Bible, it means everybody else out there. It means enemies. It means they are inferior persons. They are morally depraved. They aren't even human. They're actually non-human. So those are the thems. Now we get to Moses, same time. Well, of course, we know who the them are for Moses and his people, right? The Egyptians. So if you can just imagine knowing that the word Egyptian means human, and knowing that Pharaoh has captured all of these Jewish people and taken them into his city and made them slaves, he treated them like animals because he did not think they were human, and neither did any of the other Egyptians. So I can't even imagine what that must have been like. So that's the them for Moses. She says that the Hebrew Bible never portrayed Satan as a leader of an evil empire who makes war on God and humans. She said you will not find that in the Hebrew Bible anywhere. But let's find out where we're going to see Satan the first time. Okay, Numbers and Book of Job. Okay, so Numbers. Numbers and Book of Job. Okay, did I put a Numbers story in there? I guess I didn't. We see Satan as God's obedient servant, as messenger. It's like he's in the staff of the royal court of God, wherever that happens to be. Satan has his own office. You know, he's got an extension. God calls him and says, hey, listen, there's a problem down there, and you need to go fix it for me because that person's about ready to jump over a cliff. I need you to go fix it. Go help him. So Satan actually the Hebrew term was the Satan. Not capital S. The Satan is like saying the chair. It's not capitalized. It's no one's name. It's an adversarial role to be played. It's a certain character, but it's not a person. It is a role. It's like an element of storytelling. So here we've got, no we don't. There they are. So we have I think this is, that looks like an actual photograph, the one on the right. Everybody sitting around in there are talking. So these are the Hebrew storytellers. And here's a beautiful painting. So they are engaging the people and telling stories. It was very much a part of Jewish culture. So the Greek word diablos means devil. I think everybody sort of knows that. It doesn't mean a hateful person with a tail and horns. It means one who throws something across someone's path. Literally. Same as Satan. Satan and devil in any language just means somebody who just stops you from doing something. So, the Satan is not seen as malevolent. The Satan was sent to do a specific job to help you, for interference, because God knows best, right? So, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the story of Balaam. It is the only talking donkey story in the Bible, right? So, a literary scholar whose name is Neil Forsyth said this about Satan: if the path is bad, an obstruction is good. Okay? So, the story is actually in Numbers. It's about Balaam. So, Balaam is on a journey. God already told him not to go. He said, if you go there, they're going to kill you. He says, well, I'm going anyway. So he gets on his donkey, and he's driving along, right? And all of a sudden, the donkey just pulls up short, and it's like, starts telling him, no, not going. And of course, Balaam, in every single story, he's got a stick, and he's like beating the donkey to death, which I take issue with, personally. You know, but then the donkey says, but we can't go any further. And he's like, but what, you, come on. Well, you see, the donkey saw the messenger. Balaam did not. Finally, the messenger shows himself to Balaam. And he says, God sent me because you didn't obey. He said, you're going to die if you go there. Why are you going? Let's not go. Turn around. Go home. So, he was just a messenger from God. But if they were telling the story, it would be the Satan appeared, the messenger. So, and then of course, there's Job. So Job's adversary really was actually his adversary by God's permission, because God set up that whole scenario. Okay? She likes to call the Satan at that time God's roving intelligent agent. So he belonged to the RIA. Not the CIA, not the FBI, but the RIA. Now, this word shut in Hebrew means to roam. The use of this word in this story being told in the Hebrew language to the Hebrew people would make total sense to them, because they were actually under the rule of the king of Persia. And this word, so when the story is happening, Satan, well, first of all, when Satan gets in there, their first thing that happens is God says, so where have you been? What have you been doing? What have you been up to, man? And Satan says, well, I've been roaming. You know, he says, I was in Egypt the other day. Last week I was in Italy. I love Italy. It is so fabulous. You really should go. And so, why would they put the roaming part in there? What does that even, who cares? What do you mean, where have you been? What have you been doing? Okay, the reason is because this word shut, which means to roam, has everything to do with what's called the king's eye, or the king's ear at the time, because the king of Persia sent his roving intelligence agents out to roam the countryside and catch the Jews not being loyal to his kingdom. And then, of course, they would drag them in and kill them. So this word shut, to roam, and then being used in the story, they knew exactly. See, this is one of those things Rocco Arrow's talking about. To us, I'm thinking, why would God ask Satan what he'd been doing? That is so weird. Now I know why. Because it was written for the people at the time. And they understood that completely. So the Jewish storytellers of the old time, ancient times, this word, the Satan, used it all the time. And everybody then knew what that meant. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Cyrus was the king of Persia, actually, when the Jews were in Babylon. Well, he eventually let them go home. And he really was hoping that they were going to become his allies. So, he's still in Babylon, which is Syria. And so they make the trek 900 miles all the way back to Palestine, and they get there. Well, they were not warmly received. And now we have another division. Oh my gosh. I just think the poor Jewish people, I don't even know. It's amazing. So the wealthy and educated Jews who returned wanted their positions back. And the country people, the merchants, and the people who had been there working the land and living in their little towns and just trying to get, well, they're like, no, we've been here this whole time. Where have you been? What have you been doing? And now we've got another division. So it's just so unfortunate. Now we're going to talk about 4 centuries later. So this is Antiochus Epiphanes. That's the only picture I could find that's a bust of him, as you can see, that somebody just had to do. So this is 4 centuries later, right? So now we're getting into like 2nd century BC. He's now ruling Palestine, and he hates the Jews, hates them. So he wants to erase everything Jewish about the Jews. And they're going to resist, of course. And so he said no circumcising, no studying the Torah. He desecrated the temple. You know, he put Zeus in the middle of their temple, if you can even imagine. I mean, that probably really freaked him out. So there's a big revolt. So this is centuries after Babylon. Now they're centuries later, and now there's 2 sides again. Now there's the Hellenizing Jews who wanted to take advantage of a foreign country that had dominated them. They could take advantage of different cultural things because, of course, they didn't have to enforce the Jewish law, right? And then there were the steadfast Jews that said, no. And if you are a Hellenizing Jew, then you are against us. You're not a real Jew. So there's lots of fighting, intense fighting. The Maccabee family actually resumed control of the temple and the priesthood and the whole government eventually. So now we've got the Maccabean Jews versus the Hellenistic Jews. There just seemed to be always a fight going on there. So there's the rigorous laws, and then there are the Jewish people who wanted relaxed laws. They would like to have something a little relaxed. And even after their foreign enemies completely left, still the argument going on. Actually, she says in her book that the first Hanukkah, which happened during the Maccabean rule, it's about the miracle of the 1 bottle of oil that lasted 8 days. But she says that it was about fighting the Hellenistic assimilation. That was a big historical problem going on there. So here's sort of an interesting going on. So Israel was still fighting the nations, right? But within Israel, they're asking some very interesting questions. Who is really on God's side? And who walks in the way of the nations? And when they ask that question, it means, are you following the God of Israel? Or are you following Belial? Or one of the other gods, the pagan gods out there? So if you are walking in the way of the nations, then you are not even a Jew. You are not a Jewish person. So really what those 2 questions mean, well, will the real Jew please stand up? Who is God's people? Are you or are you not? The rigorists, as they were called, right, who really wanted to make sure that Jewish law stayed intact, including the Essenes. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Essenes, right? They lived out in the desert. They came about around 200 BC, and then they were in Jesus' time also. They invoked Satan to characterize their Jewish opponents. So at this point in history, Satan is no longer seen as God's faithful servant, but as something malevolent. Now you've got the antagonist, and then you've got God. Okay? So the Jews who were not very rigorous were called terrible names. They were called Satan, Beelzebub, Shemahazah, Azazel, Belial, the Prince of Darkness. Just imagine when they get into these yelling matches with each other, they're throwing these names out and screaming at the other Jews and saying, you're not even Jewish, you're this. So more and more stories started to spring up around this time about Satan and origin stories. So she says that actually, wait a minute, I'm forgetting to click. Here we go. There we go. All versions of Satan as the intimate enemy. All versions of his origin story. Like, the idea of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. That's what that was all about. So the question really is, well, how could God's own angel, remember Satan falling from heaven, become one of our enemies? The subtext of that question is, how could one of us become one of them? She says that was really what they were worried about. How could one of us become one of them? So these radical groups really turned back against the rest of the Jewish community. So now, here's the question. Who are God's people now? They're really wondering about this because there's just so much going on. Is it all of Israel? Is it just the Jews? And then this new idea God invented about moral identity, separate from the Jewish identity, which is very much attached to country and culture. They wanted to leave aside this ethnic identity to redefine human community in terms of morality. And so the moral Jews are the ones who became the Christians. This is a huge historical shift, because this is a time when the Christians were no longer identifying themselves as Jewish, but as something completely different. Okay, the Essenes. What a group of people. Oh my gosh. I would never have been an Essene back in the day, I'm telling you. They embraced the whole idea of this huge cosmic battle between angels and demons, and it was actually the center of their own cosmology and their politics. And they condemned any other Jew that did not hold these views. Now you have to realize they are out in the desert on the other side of Jerusalem, right? They've got this, you can find pictures online of their settlement with these clay buildings that of course have fallen apart now. But they lived out there. They hated the Romans, but they really struggled bitterly with their fellow Israelites. So during first century, when Jesus was actually alive, during his time, Essenes, only men, no women were allowed to be an Essene. So if you had a spiritual awakening yourself somehow, and you were a girl, forget it. You were not allowed. You couldn't even go there. You were not allowed in. They were forming a new Israel in the caves out in the desert. Her opinion, Pagel's opinion, if Satan had not been invented in the earlier Jewish tradition, that the Essenes definitely would have invented this character, because they just, they even saw the invasion of Palestine. It proves that the evil forces are taking over the world. That was what they were preaching. So, if you wanted to join the Essenes, well, you had to be a freeborn Jewish man. You had to proclaim, I am a sinner. You had to be on probation. You had to be celibate. So no more kids for you. Your personal possessions were given all to the community. You had to be pure in everything you did. Eating, drinking, what you could say, what you could touch. No swearing. Well, that lets me out. No spitting. I'm okay with that. No talking out of turn. That definitely lets me out. No complaining about the leaders. I mean, these were their actual rules. This is what they were not allowed to do. And then when you got initiated, finally, you had to bless the community. You had to curse everyone else outside the community. And you got the secrets of angelology. Now, how Jesus-like does that sound? It does not. Because Jesus doesn't curse people. Doesn't curse people he doesn't know. Doesn't curse people out there. And so, I bless everybody here, but everybody out there, forget it. So, okay. If you want to choose to follow that, you just go right ahead. So Matthew and Mark actually saw the beginning of Jesus' movement, which of course Jesus wasn't starting a movement. He was an itinerant preacher. He was the rabbi who taught lessons at the well in the middle of town, right? So, he doesn't get a publicist. He doesn't get an advertising guy, because he's not doing that. But some people make it sound like that's what was happening. There I am. But Matthew and Mark saw Jesus' movement actually just primarily in the context of this is the Jewish community where we live, this is who's going to be Jesus' followers. But its future would actually increasingly depend on the outside world, which would be the Gentiles. So Jesus' followers were very disappointed by 100 because the Jewish response was really poor. Nobody wanted to leave their culture and their heritage behind to go with another group because they had this whole entire culture their whole lives. So they were forced to really start preaching to the Gentiles. Any comments or questions? I see Kathy and Catherine back there smiling a lot. I'm assuming that's because I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys already know all that stuff.
One of the things I've been told, and I can't give you a source for it, is that with the Essenes, every time they went to the bathroom, number 2,
Yeah?
they had to be cleansed again and quote unquote baptized again.
Oh my gosh.
Purification. Yeah, every time.
If you eat too much fiber, oh my gosh, you're really in trouble.
Get water bottles.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there are lots of books written about the Essenes because they were such a bizarre group, actually. But they were really the rigorous at the time. So I would definitely say, taking a bath, a shower maybe, but getting baptized again? Oh my goodness. Well, that's very interesting. So anyway, it is now almost 11 o'clock. Does anybody need to take a break? Stand up and move around or do anything? Are we okay? How's it? Everybody okay? Trying to see everybody up there. I have to wear these glasses in order to see the computer. But I really need other glasses to see you out there. Okay, well we'll go on a little bit more then. So I was thinking that we would stop at noon, have a little lunch, and just get out of this room and do something else. Okay, now we're going to talk about Matthew's Gospel. Now remember how we learned Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Remember? Matthew, well, it should be Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So I don't know who started Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No, Mark was the first gospel written, about 10 years after Jesus left. Matthew was next in line. So now we're going to talk about him. So he was really fighting his Jewish counterpart, everybody in his community. So this word Gentile is actually Latin and it means the nations, which means anybody not Jewish, basically. So Gentile means the nations. So between 70 and 100, this is when Matthew and Luke and John were writing, about that time. Matthew's got a whole thing going now. Get up there. She just didn't want to do that. So now the groups are all struggling to find a place in the community, in the larger Jewish community. Some of them were really having a hard time. And they were actually meeting in homes because some of them just couldn't go to the synagogues. Now, I can't even imagine culturally, if you are a Jewish person and you live in this country that the whole culture is Jewish, it's how you eat, how you sleep, how you get married, how you have friends, how your children are supposed to behave, how you relate to God. And now all of a sudden there's these little upstarts, these young upstarts that come, and they start talking about completely different things. I can't even imagine it. So anyway, they started meeting in homes because they were thrown out of the synagogues. If you believe that Jesus was the Messiah, you are not welcome here. But their movement spread out the entire Roman Empire. So in about the 2nd century, the Roman Empire goes from Great Britain. I'm going to turn on this way because I'm looking at a map, right? Imaginary map. You got Great Britain over here, through all of Europe, down through Italy, and then you got Greece and Turkey and Asia. Huge, huge. And it was that way until 500 CE. So what did those groups look like? Well, there were Christians with Jews, Christians with Gentiles, and then there were Christians that had Jews and Gentiles in their groups. And it really depended on who they were following, because each group differed based on that person, whoever that was. So we have a few ideas here. So we have James, Jesus' brother. he stayed in Jerusalem, and he was very observant of Jewish law. So some people were really attracted to him. And then we've got Peter, who's doing some modified stuff. And so if you weren't so strict, that would be a good place to go if you wanted to. And then Paul, who was a converted Pharisee, he attracted the Gentiles who actually were associated with some of the Jewish synagogues, which makes sense because that's where his people would be, and that would be, his job, or where he was. So between 70 and 100, Matthew, Luke, and John were becoming Christians at that time. Because in the beginning, there's Mark. Nobody's talking about being a Christian. They're all still Jews trying to get along, and some of them are saying Jesus is the Messiah, and the majority of Jews are saying no, he's not. So there was no thought of church or Christianity or any of that. But as we move along in the Gospels, the Jews are slowly starting to become what we would call Christians, and they were attempting to forge this new identity. So that's why there's no Mark there, because he's not really doing anything in that area because it wasn't thought of at the time he was writing. So Matthew's Gospel, he tried to do community rule, which basically means it's kind of, we're going to stay together and these are the rules, but not like the Essene rules. It wasn't strict like that, but they really wanted to have a community, and they were more liberal than the Essenes. Luke's Gospel, now they say Luke was the only Gentile writer. Okay, and he had mostly Gentiles, which of course makes perfect sense. But he also started saying that his group inherited Israel's legacy as God's people. Now you can imagine how mad that made the Jewish leaders. That this Gentile guy, never was even a Jew, is now saying that he's God's people and his people are God's people. So honestly, I'm actually surprised that the Jews didn't just outright kill everybody. That's it, because they are just being so offensive to the Jewish culture, actually. And then we've got John's Gospel here, in which he talks about the feeling that you get from John's Gospel is that there's this very close-knit group of Jesus' own, as he puts it. The love, all the love lines are in there. Love one another. John said that Jesus said, love one another. But then all his Jewish opponents, the offspring of Satan. He's saying that Jesus said that. And yet, he's saying Jesus said, love one another. Really? Are you kidding? No. I don't believe that for 1 minute. I really don't. I'm sorry, John, but no dice. At least from this girl here. So these Gospels plus Mark became canon in around 200 CE, which means that canon meant it becomes part of the New Testament. If it's not canon, you shouldn't be reading it, okay? But they chose those because they could form a basis of these loose communities that were everywhere. It's kind of like why the old Jewish guys wrote the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. Get everybody together. Get everybody on the same page. The four Gospels, of course, were not the only things about Jesus' life, because stories of Jesus spread all over, from, like I said, from Great Britain all the way down to Asia, to Egypt, everywhere. There were these wonderful stories. And remember, and Paul actually went to Syria, Asia, and Greece, over there on the right side. And there were lots of other writings about Jesus also. Okay? There was the Gospel of Thomas, which many of us know that came from Nag Hammadi. Okay? Then we got the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. They found that in 1896 in Egypt also. And then we've got the Book of James, which was also found at Nag Hammadi. They were all called heresy. Certain church members denounced those. And of course, there were like 13 to 15 codices that they found at Nag Hammadi, and all of them were like, no, nope, we don't like those. The earlier Christians really wanted to know how to be good Christians. They wanted to know how to be good followers of Jesus. And the four Gospels are supposed to be how to do that. So, traditional Christians would say, leaders, would say, you get to God by believing in Jesus. This is a huge distinction. The Gospel of Thomas, which they are calling heresy, says that you must discover the Christ within. That if you want to find the kingdom of God, you've got to go in. That, of course, is Gnostic. Gnosis, which comes from the Greek word what is it? Knowing. Thank you. Knowing. Thank you, Rick. Knowing. It means inner knowing. It doesn't mean somebody gives you information and that's how you figure it out. So, and of course, Rocco Errico would say, do you believe Jesus or do you believe in Jesus? Big distinction. Do you believe Jesus or do you believe in Jesus? Just ponder that. I thought that was great. He gives a whole lecture on that, actually. It's just wonderful. So Matthew's Jesus actually interprets the Torah so that Gentiles can also fulfill the law, the Jewish law. And you can imagine how that made the Jewish leaders really mad, right? Because no, only Jews can fulfill the Jewish law. You're a Gentile. You're not even Jewish. How can you do that? He was encouraging people to abandon their cultural and ethnic identification with Israel. So that was actually probably causing more problems, I think, than that you're rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. I mean, this whole thing was like visceral to them. And of course, there was another bitter controversy because culture was definitely important to the whole Jewish community there. So she says in different chapters in Matthew, which would take forever to go through every single one of them, so I'm just not. If you really want to know, you can read her book. In chapter 10, 12, and 13, she says Jesus mentions the evil one. I still don't. Chapter 16, Matthew calls Israel, that Israel has now become Jesus' church. I don't know about that. In chapter 23, there's a whole, Jesus is very bitterly hostile. Okay, expressing really hostile words towards the scribes and the Pharisees. And then he mentions hell, and Jesus curses them and calls them hypocrites many times. John actually got into that pretty much in his gospel also, which we'll talk about in a minute. So many Jews saw the first century Christians as putting aside all the ritual precepts that defined their Jewish identity. But I think that was the idea. They were becoming something different. And because it was happening so slowly, it's like they didn't see it yet. But the Pharisees, they actually saw Jesus' followers as threatening Israel's integrity, if not their very existence. Okay, their very existence. So this is the part that I'm like, well, why didn't they get the Romans to kill more of them? I would have. I mean, really. I mean, if you can just go around killing people at that time, right? Just get rid of them. There's not that many of them. Come on, we can do that all in one fell swoop. Just throw them in the Colosseum. You know, just, they could. They really could have. But that was just not to be, of course. And it's pretty amazing how this many people, to start a movement around this many people, actually is still alive today. That's the amazing part. So, now Matthew's idea was that fulfilling the law had nothing to do with your ethnicity. You don't have to be Jewish, right? So it's moral action. Follow the golden rule, love God, love your neighbor, and then of course there's that all popular judgment day. Whether you're going to find out whether you're going to go to heaven or hell. So that was his idea. And of course the Jews were really pushing back on them. They're like, no. And this made them even madder. To be included in God's kingdom, you do not have to be Jewish. Yay, the Gentiles can get in. Okay? You don't have to be Jewish anymore. All of a sudden, they just made it up, right? They said it depends on your justice, your generosity, and your compassion, which is the moral code. So, during this time, I imagine that the Jewish community, the leaders, I imagine that the little Jewish people going along doing their job, the merchants and the people in town, and, people who couldn't read. It was like this was not a big deal in their lives, but to the Jewish leaders,
Whew, big stuff. So that was Matthew. Any questions? Any comments?
It sounds like during these years then after Jesus, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of transformation, a lot of even divisiveness, different camps going different ways, different slants on what he brought.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around this and how we got from there to here.
That's why I read the book twice.
How we came through these, even that 200-year period. They're concepts I don't usually sit with, but they're foundational to where we are now, 2,000 years later.
Well, the reason that the reason that Pagels is actually so celebrated is because her book completely demolished the scholar's idea that Christianity was a cohesive unit, even from the very beginning. Big fat lie.
Even the
It
notion,
was not. We're talking about hundreds of years. It was still a mess.
even the name Christianity, where did that name come from? When did it begin to enter? When
Well,
did it become?
I actually tried to find that. Velma, do you know? The year, the century?
Though the date? No.
No date.
No, it came from Greek, which is a
Christos.
mistranslation.
Oh.
Yeah, it should be Mashiach. And that is Aramaic, and of course ancient Aramaic was the square Hebrew, one and the same. But, and so it's just something that caught on, and Dr. Lamsa went ahead, translated that into the Bible simply because he was trying to get the Bible
Out, right.
out and published as one of those things. That was what people called the Messiah,
Well, it came from, I guess, Christ.
Came from Christ. But
Christian
that
came
is
from
Greek.
Christ.
That's
Right.
Greek.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with Aramaic.
Aramaic,
which
right.
Jesus spoke and lived and taught.
Right.
So,
So basically, we don't really know, like, the date, maybe not even the century at this point.
But it came on the scene following Jesus' arrival.
But that was long after Jesus was gone. Long after.
Jesus would not have used the word.
No. So if you
no,
see the
there
word,
were no Christians.
Right.
Right.
He was a Jew.
That's my point.
yes, Jesus was Jew. No, this word church and Christian, I would say at least 100 years later, maybe. Because for a long time they were thinking that they were Jews that just believed a little something different.
Yeah.
They were still identifying with Jewishness when Mark was writing. The important thing to understand about the four Gospels, which I said in the very beginning, is they were not following Jesus around in Jesus' time in 33 CE, writing down everything he said. They were not doing that. They were writing about Jesus 35 years earlier, about Jesus 60 years earlier, 80 years earlier. They were not writing about what was happening. Oops. They were not writing about what was happening in Jesus' time. It all reflected what was happening while they were writing. And that is really the thing that most people don't actually know. I thought Jesus was Catholic. My friend Susan thought Jesus was a Presbyterian. I mean, that's how, hold on, Denise, just a second. That is how I was indoctrinated. I'm a cradle Catholic. That is how much I thought of Jesus as being Catholic. I never knew he was Jewish until I was 35. And another survived Catholic told me that. And I was like, whoa, I almost fell off my chair. I said, no, he was Catholic. She's like, no, honey, he was a Jew. And I was like, what? Are you kidding? My friend Susan and I were 7 years old. We went and we laid down on the street in Churchill Court. I'm on this left tires. She's on where the right tires would be. We're lying on the road. Now, a car was going to come down the street and run over us. Whoever Jesus saved, that's what he was. He was either Presbyterian or Catholic. Well, fortunately, Myrtle, the housekeeper, came out and found us and jerked us up off the street and took us inside because her brother was having a conniption fit. He was like 3. He was freaking out that his sister was about to die. And I said, well, of course she is, because Jesus was Catholic. So, I mean, that's, why would I think Jesus was Catholic? I heard it somewhere. Denise?
If you're interested in the historical context of the early church, I'd recommend reading Zealot by Reza Aslan. He's
Oh, right,
he's a historian, not a Christian scholar.
right.
And I think he does an excellent job of describing the social and political context of the time.
I have actually read that. That's a very good book also. Of course, the interesting thing is that, hold on just a second. The scholars argue now among themselves. They still don't know who killed Jesus. Was it the Jews? Was it the Romans? They're still arguing that over 2,000 years later, right? To some people, it really makes a difference. To other people, it does not. I don't really care. But to some people, they really get, about if you say one way or the other. And historically, they just can't know. My daughter used to say, I can't know. Well, they can't know. They've read everything they can read, and they found every single hidden everything, and they still can't actually know. Catherine.
Just to say that Luke, writing in the book of Acts, says that they were first called Christians in Antioch.
That's Greece? It's Antioch, Greece?
Yes, I think. And that was in Acts 11:26.
I didn't know Luke wrote Acts. I thought Luke only wrote the Gospel of Luke.
But some people assume he wrote the book of Acts also.
Well, they don't even know if Luke wrote it.
Right.
They don't even know.
Whoever wrote the book
Whoever
of Acts.
says that. Okay, that's interesting to know, and it started in Greece. So you're right, Rick. It's. But see, the thing about it is that Pagels really, she upset everybody in the community of early Christian scholars by proving, by all this research she did, that the early Christian church was all over the place. Literally, physically, all over the place. And there was this Christian group fighting this Christian group. Oh, I didn't even get to the juicy parts yet. Really, I'm telling you, I'm about to. But there's some really interesting juicy parts in here. But it just kind of makes you wonder. I mean, one time I said to somebody that Martin Luther was a Catholic priest first, and he was not. I said, yeah, he was a monk. He lived in a little town. And she goes, no, he was Lutheran. I go, no, he was not Lutheran. He was Catholic. He was a monk in a little tiny town. And he got really upset because the bishops would come in their beautiful robes, and the cardinals and even maybe the Pope would show up in the 16th century or so. So that's 1500s. That's like what, medieval times, right? And they would ask the little village lady there with her little tiny child in rags to give the last farthing and sou to the bishop, standing there dressed in his gold clothes, because they were buying indulgences in heaven. If you want to get to heaven, you just give me all the money you have, and I will go put it in this box over here, and I'll tell God all about you, and you'll go to heaven. What malarkey. But they believed it because they were illiterate and they only believed what they were told. So Martin Luther just said, I'm done with that. I guess we call him Father Martin. He was done with that. Although I don't really like him either, which I will tell you about later. Because he's just like everybody else. Just like everybody else. Unfortunately. So if you're Lutheran, I apologize. But you can't help what history says about people and who they are. Do we have a Lutheran in here? Are you guys Lutheran back there? You gonna kill me on the way out the door? No, okay. Not for that. But you're gonna kill me for some other reason. Okay, and if I deserve it.
Thank you, Kathy.
Actually, Nancy, I just wanted to comment
Yeah.
something that Rocco Errico also teaches in all his classes, that, the Christian movement was not one cohesive, glorious movement. That
Right.
It was infighting all.
But people thought that it was until, Pagels wrote her first book like in 1975. So, we're talking about people coming up to the idea that what? It wasn't cohesive? It just didn't start and honestly, the first Christians were Catholics. The Catholic Church is the first Christian church. And they didn't even call themselves Christians. Because my friend Susan and I used to argue, she's a Presbyterian. I'm not Christian. I'm Christian, you're Catholic. And you just see her, hands on her hips. You're not even a Christian, you're just a Catholic. I'm like, okay. So people have a hard time even using that word to realize that all Christianity came from Catholicism, period. They don't want to hear it, they don't want to know about it, they think I'm lying. And I'm like, no, it started off to be called Catholic, the Roman Catholic Church, and then in the Protestant Reformation, 16th century, that's the 1500s, you got Martin Luther and all these people that are saying, get out of here, I'm not going to be Catholic anymore, this is terrible. And actually, Lutheranism didn't even give the name Luther until Martin Luther was long dead. He was just a spin-off group of Catholics. And then eventually they called themselves Lutherans, which of course makes sense. But he did not start the Lutheran religion. But people decided to call it Lutheranism. We're Lutherans. We follow Martin Luther. Simple, right? Anything else? When I read this for the second time, sometimes I just laugh. I just have to laugh at some of the stuff because it's so shocking that people don't know these things because they don't investigate. It's like they just don't go deeper. I mean, I've always been a person that went deeper. I just find it fascinating, completely and totally fascinating. I think I can get through the next chapter before lunch. What is it? Oh, Luke and John. How does that prayer go? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Was it bless this something? Something? Must have been Catholic. Rick, you remember that?
I don't know.
So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bless this bread and I lay on. How are the apostles going to do that? How are the gospel writers going to do anything for me? Now that I think about it. I mean, okay. I believe I would have been a Gnostic. Very definitely I would have been a Valentinian. And we'll talk about Valentinus here in a minute. But make no mistake about it, as we move into 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, the tug of war for money and power in the Catholic Church is not to be questioned, because it is definitely there. I don't know how they're doing these days, but back then it was pretty hideous, I'm gonna say. So, now, we're gonna talk about Luke a little bit. So, now the split is widening. Okay, this is Luke. Luke and John we're going to talk about. So this is like 80 to 100, somewhere in there. And basically, these guys didn't even know each other. Like, Matthew, Luke, and John might have used like early Mark, and then maybe as they went later, maybe they might have used earlier Matthew. But in reality, Luke completely washes out Matthew, does a whole new thing. Okay? So, Luke's intention really is to show that the followers of Jesus, and remember, Luke is a Gentile who turns into a Christian, showing that Jesus' people were really deeply attached to the temple and followed, and that they were the only genuine Israelites actually left in Israel. And they were closer to God than the Pharisees. Now, can you just imagine how mad that made them? Oh, I would be just furious if you tried to say you were better than me. I mean, really, that's really what she says he's saying. That we're the real people of God, not you guys anymore. We are. So, spiritual warfare between God and Satan actually increases during Luke's gospel. So, And remember, Luke is speaking from the perspective of a Gentile convert. He was never attached to the land or to that culture, ever, to the Jewish culture. And his view radically is about Jesus is definitely different than Matthew. But he does agree with Paul when he said that God offers salvation to everyone. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are like, no, just the Jews. Just this group, you guys are out of luck. So, where Matthew and Mark imply that Jesus' Jewish enemies were in league with the devil, she says that Luke makes it way more plainly, especially when Jesus was arrested. And Luke shows Satan working through human agents to plot to kill Jesus. You can actually even, every time I came across anything that I think somebody might have painted a picture of it, I would go on Google Images and try to find it. There's even a painting of the Pharisees all together plotting Jesus' death. I think. I'm not sure. I said Jews killing Jesus, the Pharisees killing. I mean, I put everything in there just to try to find different. Of course, there's no photographs of Satan. Somebody said, "Are you going to have photos of Satan?" I go, "No, I don't think so. I don't believe there are none." And I don't think there's even one photograph. So, also in Luke, if you will remember, and if you even look at a picture, somebody paints something from Luke that has to do with in the Garden of Gethsemane when they come and get Jesus, there are no Roman soldiers there in Luke's account. It is the elders and the officers of the temple. There's no Roman soldiers with swords in his account, according to Pagels. Okay. So Luke's story about when Jesus got arrested is different from Mark and Matthew. And like I said, biblical scholars today still do not know what happened. Because in one story, they took him to the Sanhedrin at night. In another story, they waited till the morning because the Sanhedrin never meets at night because that's the Jewish rules, Jewish law. So, there's a lot of argument going on. And like I said, I don't actually care. I'm not going to argue with anybody about it because it's just irrelevant to the whole story. But Luke wants to show that anybody who rejected Jesus as the Messiah is accomplishing Satan's work on earth. Also, she says that Luke's story contributed to everyone's perception of Pilate as this well-meaning weakling, and that the Jewish people were actually responsible for Jesus' death. There is a well-known French commentator, his name is Alfred Loisy. He says, according to Luke, the Jews are the authors of all evils. That he was a Gentile. So he had no attachment to Jewish heritage and culture whatsoever. So it wasn't easy for him to say that and do that because he had no attachment whatsoever. She thinks that, because Luke was a pagan, a Gentile, that he just never attached himself to the Jewishness that the Jews were trying to figure out how to get away from when they became Christian. Back in the day also, when you were a Jewish person being interested in Jesus being the Messiah, the early people said you have to now if you're a Gentile, you have to become Jewish first, then you get to become Christian. Forget it. I'm not going through two religions to get to the other one. But they wanted you to be Jewish enough so that you understood the laws because they were still following Jewish law until they weren't. Okay, so now we are actually going to move to John. So apparently, John was writing 90 to 100, 10 years after Luke, and Pagel says that he might have been a Jewish convert. So they don't actually really know. But there were a series of clashes between Jesus' followers at the time John was writing, and it was really bad. It had really escalated by this time. And then in one scene, John says that Jesus said, "You are of your father, the devil." And all I hear is, "Luke, I am your father." That's what I heard. I heard Darth Vader. Because Jesus, I just can't imagine he said that. I don't know if y'all can imagine. I can't. It's just so heavy and so just, that does not make sense to me. Now, and then in John, the Jews retaliate by accusing Jesus of being a Samaritan. That's like calling a black person the N-word right to their face. It was such a slight coming from the Jews telling Jesus, oh, you're just a Samaritan, which means you're not really a Jew. And they said he was demon-possessed and insane. Well, I believe that the Jews might have said that to Jesus because they hated him. They really did not like him. So calling him a Samaritan was like sort of the worst thing they could do. You know, using that language. However, Pagel says that it is John's, that Jesus' words, bitter words, were actually a reflection of John and how he was feeling about the rest of the Jewish community, because there was so much fighting going on between them and the synagogues. In fact, they even made up a word. If you are thrown out of your synagogue, you are a aposynagogue. You aposynagogue, you. That's like saying some terrible thing to somebody, like the B word or the other B word or any kind of word, right? But if you call somebody you're a aposynagogue, it's like, blech. You don't want anybody to call you that. It means you are someone who got thrown out of the synagogue. It means you believe Jesus is Messiah and you're not even a Jew, so get out of here. Don't even talk to me. Talk to the hand. I mean, it was just the worst to be called that. So this bitter conflict was really bad. And there is a scholar, his name is Louis Martin, and he says, I'm just going to read this because it's really a great sentence. This traumatic separation defined how John's group saw itself as a tiny minority of God's people, hated by the world, a group that urged its members to reject in turn the whole social and religious world into which they had been born. So that was traumatic, that they could not actually go into the synagogue anymore. And he suggests that this crisis occurred between 80 and 115 when a group of Jewish scholars decided to introduce into synagogue worship this little piece called Benediction of the Heretics. They were invoking a curse specifically on the Nazarenes, which was Jesus' followers, of course, because he was Jesus of Nazareth, right? So they specifically identified the Nazarenes, and they cursed them as heretics. So why would you want to go into a place that's going to do that to you? You wouldn't. So John's story of Jesus' life shows this cosmic conflict between dark and light, and that Jesus' group was very close-knit, and they were against the sinful opposition. And that Jesus came as the light of the world to save us, and that there was a separation of the sons of light, Jesus and his followers. They separated them from the offspring of darkness, which was the devil. So John actually never pictures Satan as an actual character of his own, but it's the people who take on that adversarial role. Did I miss that? What happened? Oh, let me go back there. There it is, right there. So in the temptation, he doesn't go into do the desert thing with Jesus after the baptism. He doesn't go there. He has the crowd of people who are tempting Jesus, saying, we need you to prove yourself. And Jesus is like, well, let me tell you about bread. So he deflects, right? He deflects in his little sermon there. It's his parable, and he talks about the true bread of heaven. That's where that happens. And that was in chapter 6 of John. Then chapter 7, Jesus is actually challenged by his own brothers to go to Judea, where they know they want to kill Jesus. They want to kill him. And they're saying, well, no, you go, you prove yourself. Okay? We're gonna test your strength. Can you go do it? And Jesus is like, no, nope, not going there. So the next slide, which is, bing, So John's decision to make an actual identifiable group into a symbol for evil, we are talking about religious, social, and political implications from all of this. It wasn't just talking about your religion, who you decide to worship. This is like really, really big. So there's a commentator named Raymond Brown who says the Passion, which is fully half of John, because he left a lot of stuff out, was really a struggle between Jesus and Satan. Also, in John's gospel, he used the word the Jews more than any other gospel. Count them. Way more than Mark or Matthew or Luke. And that's because, remember, they're saying he was Jewish, and so he was more estranged from the Jewish majority than the others at this time. And so he was just sticking them with it, The Jews did this and the Jews did that. And people said you could argue John's use of the Jews all day long. Because when he used it, they're not even sure which Jews he was talking about. A lot of times, of course, it was the leaders, but then it could have just been any old Jews anywhere. So she said you could really argue that forever. So Pagel sees John's story as more of his version of the Passion. It's not just about just the crucifixion, but it's about the crucifixion as a judgment, not against Jesus, but shows God's judgment against the world. So it's not just a story about Jesus and getting crucified. It's like bigger than that. So John also condemns anybody as a son of darkness who had anything to do and participated within Jesus' destruction. So he gets pretty heavy there. But the words that he's using, he's writing his own words based on his own feelings about what is happening to him and his little tiny group at the time. John shows that the Jewish leaders were very worried that if Jesus caused an uproar anywhere in the Jewish community, that the Roman armies were just going to come flying in. The soldiers would come in and retaliate. And so the Jewish leaders wanted to shut Jesus up, even if it was wrong. They didn't care. They just wanted to keep the Roman soldiers out of their knickers. Just get out. Stay out of my life. Don't come anywhere near us. Just stay over there. They really worked hard trying to do that. Anything about Luke and John? Any interest? Any questions? Anything? I should have said don't bring lunch. We'll be done pretty soon. Really, I'm afraid if it was any longer, it just might be just way too boring. Do I have you so far? Is this boring? Is everybody like dying? I mean, is everybody okay? I haven't seen anybody snoring in there.
I'm writing.
You should. Velma's writing, taking notes. I personally just found all this information very, very fascinating. So it's only 11:37. So I'm going to move on to chapter 6, and actually, if you all just would even give me a few minutes, we might not even have to eat lunch because I'll be done.
We will have to have a bathroom break.
Oh, well, but actually, in a few minutes, we could do a bathroom break now if you'd like, or like I said, anybody can go to the bathroom anytime they need it. Of course, we'll know that's what you're doing if I'm still talking. Right? I don't know. We'll all know. But we don't care. So if you need to borrow the bathroom, please do.
We don't want to miss you, Nancy.
Well, okay. Well, so, yes, all right, so chapter 6, this last chapter is about demonizing the heretics. Really, really interesting. Got a lot of pictures in here about all these different apostolic fathers and all these guys moving into 3rd century. So, would you like to take a break? Let's take a break. Let's take like a 10-minute break or so. Get up. We'll talk about him yet. He is coming up. Chapter 5. This is her book in chapter 5. It's called Satan's Earthly Kingdom, Christians Against the Pagans. And then the last one is the Christians Against the Heretics. So this is the juicy chapters right here, 5 and 6. Should be good. So, everybody comfortable? Everybody have a little something to eat? Doing good? Okay. Well,
Yes, we're alive and awake.
we will definitely get out of here before 6.
Well, that's better than I told him last week, midnight, so you're doing good.
That's right. She said, yeah. When I told her when I started working on this, it was like hours and hours. I went, oh no, I'll never stay awake that long. So, anyway, I just have chapter 5, 6, and and a little bit of a conclusion. But actually, chapter 5 and 6, I have a lot of pictures in this one. Because I found lots of pictures of all these rulers and all these different interesting people. So, so we're going to start here with talking about the Christians against the pagans. We already did the Christians against the Jews of their time. So now we're going to talk about how there's a whole thing with the pagans. So between 70 and 100, okay, which is about the time when Luke and John were writing, the Christian movement becomes huge, okay? It becomes largely Gentile in the whole Roman Empire, and we are talking about, Asia Minor, which is actually Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Africa, Greece, it's all over the place. And now it's the Gentile converts versus the pagans, which of course is going to be the Romans in the Jerusalem area. And so, but the conflict is still now with the Christians talking about abandoning their ancestral customs and breaking those sacred bonds that all the Jewish people had grown up with. Plus also pagans had sacred bonds that they had to break in order to become Christian. So the early Christians saw Satan, of course, as their fellow Jews. And later Christians now, the Gentile converts are being persecuted by the Romans, who are also pagans. So, and the Romans, they worship all kinds of different gods. And Matthew and Luke both were showing the Romans and the Gentile, any of them, in favorable light because they were hoping to make potential converts. Politics at its best. Don't you think? Right? You cannot keep politics out of the Catholic Church. Not even today. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he says, we're not even fighting human beings because we are fighting against spiritual evil forces. We're not even fighting humans. I'm like, are you kidding? Really? If they had horns, I might believe you, but they don't. So that they are seen as fighting spiritual warfare. Oxymoron, I think. So, to the Jews, religion and nation are one. To the Christians, they don't care anymore. And that's what they're showing. So, now we're going to go, so now we get into the fun stuff. Justin Martyr is a guy who was born in Turkey. His parents were pagan. And in 140, he goes to Rome to study philosophy. Okay? And one of the first things he does, because, when you move into a new town, you always want to know what are the sights that you should see. Well, somebody told him, go to the Colosseum. You'll see the best entertainment you've ever seen in your life. It's better than Netflix. You need to go. This is really good stuff. Well, so he goes and he sees the Christians being killed. Left and right? Left and right. By the lions and the tigers and the bears and by the gladiators. Because the Romans found that very entertaining. So Justin Martyr goes there. Justin goes there and he is so impressed with these Christians who just stand there and take it. He's like, how are they doing that? Is their faith so strong that they're not trying to run away from the lion or from the guy that's got the sword that's going to chop his head off? How are they doing it? Although he wasn't that curious, because before he even gets to anything Christianity, he starts searching. Because as a young man, living in Turkey, he just didn't find anything that really was juicy enough for him. So, when he's 40, which seems to be the time when all these people seem to go looking for life, he goes to Rome. And so now he's seen the Colosseum and he's kind of wondering about them. But so first he goes and he talks to somebody that is of the Zeno school of Stoicism. There's a bust there of Zeno. Of course, now all the people we're going to be talking about, they're not alive now, right? Because the philosophers he sees at that time are all, they're all dead, but they're schools of those thoughts. So he goes to a Zeno, who's a Stoic philosopher. Well, he couldn't explain anything about God at all. And so Justin was really not happy about that. So then he goes to a peripatetic school, which is Aristotle. And peripatetic means Aristotle loved to walk and talk at the same time. So he was a peripatetic philosopher. He didn't sit and talk, he walked and talked. But that guy was way too eager for his fee, and so Justin said, no, not doing it. So then he goes to a Pythagorean guy. That's this guy, right? Well, wait a minute. Uh-oh. Oh, no, it's still working. Bing. Oh, wait. Oh, there it is. That guy. Oh, see, it doesn't show. It doesn't show on there because it shows there. It's not on there, which is where you need it to show. So you see Pythagoras, he's standing there with his little pyramid. And, well, that guy wanted him to learn music, astronomy, and geometry first. Then he's going to talk about God. And Justin said, no, not doing it. So subsequently, he actually adopted Platonism. So here we have Plato down here. Now, if you take this picture and move it here, Aristotle and Plato are talking to each other. This is in the same painting as this one right here. Okay, so they love to walk and talk. So he's adopted Platonism, and he seems to be okay with it. But then he meets an old Christian man, and every day they have lunch at Starbucks. And they're just drinking their coffee, and they're just chatting away. So Justin is picking his brain, and so he's thinking he's going to reach the divine through using his mind. He's like getting really excited. But then the old man tells him the exact opposite. He says, your mind is fraught with demonic powers. Everybody's mind has just got the demons in there. First you have to be exercised, and then you have to be baptized. Then maybe something will happen. So he's all in now. He's all in. He thinks that's great. So he just redoubles his efforts. And he renounces everything that he used to know. And he's really bolstered by the ascetic life of the Christians. Now he's starting to realize how the Christians can stand in the Colosseum when there's a lion running at him. Because he realizes, oh, I got it now. And he goes around, he becomes an itinerant preacher. And he is preaching the moral and spiritual superiority of the Christian doctrine. And he's very austere. So he really accepted it hook, line, and sinker, especially right around the time that he was born, and the time that he was in Rome. Totally, Christianity, we're battling those cosmic forces, big time. So he's going around preaching that, and also that the humanity is completely helpless because of demoniac forces, not because of other humans, and not by the divine, like Zeus and all those people up there just going zap and just kind of doing fun things towards humans. No, the gods are not doing it. Humans are not doing it. The demoniac forces are doing it. He sees himself as an active combatant, kind of like he would have been a good Essene, probably. And actually, the presence of any Christians anywhere just makes the pagans really mad. They really hate them. In fact, being a Christian became criminalized in Rome. And so that's where the catacombs come in. Because they made it a crime to be Christian. And he believes that the hatred that the pagans feel towards Christians is actually caused by what else? Evil spirits. Okay. Now, no, Origen, not your turn yet. Quintus Junius Rusticus. You can't tell he's Roman, can you? With a name like that, really? What was his mother thinking? He is a teacher and a politician. And first of all, Justin he's out with his little group and he's preaching and preaching and preaching. Well, you know he's going to get caught, right? So he does. He and his little group of 6 get caught. And so he's in a trial now, and this Rusticus character is the head of the trial. And the trial, they actually have a trial record of this whole trial with Justin Martyr. And so Rusticus asks Justin and his little friends about their Christian beliefs. But he didn't care, because what he ended up doing was he beheaded all of them in 165. Just chopped their heads off because they didn't offer sacrifice to the gods. So I guess when you're in charge, your gods are in charge. And because they would not make offerings to the gods, they said, well, you're not following imperial decrees about that, so it's a capital offense, so off with your head. So off they went. That was the end of that. So then we got Origen of Alexandria. He is an early Christian scholar. He's like 185 to 253. So now we're, looking at like 3rd century there. He was influential, but very controversial. At 18, he was considered brilliant. Really, really brilliant guy. He also taught for many, many years. But he escaped persecution until he was in his mid-60s. That was around 241. And he encouraged anybody that was tortured and killed that was a Christian for their Christianity, for Christ's sake. He said, death only brings victory. So don't think of it as bad if they kill you because you believe in Jesus. Just don't even worry about it. But they caught him finally, and they arrested and brutally tortured him. They wanted him to claim out in public that he was going to renounce his faith. He refused to do it. They did not kill him, but that torture eventually took its toll on him. Now, if he had just lasted a little longer and stayed hidden just a tiny bit, he would have been under the rule of Philip the Arab, who was considered the first Christian emperor. Well, unfortunately, Philip was only an emperor for 5 years, and they assassinated him. So I guess they didn't like him because they didn't want Christian rulers. So he definitely got assassinated, and then, but he was not persecuting the Christians. But the next guy after him, he was really bad.
Nancy,
Yeah.
if you go back, just answer this question. Justin Martyr, who came upon the scene, was he one of those beheaded?
Yes, he and his 6 companions
Okay.
were beheaded by Rusticus.
Okay. Thank you.
That was in 165.
Okay. Thank you.
So your life really depended on who was the emperor at the time. And apparently Philip, he was actually good to the Christians, but the next guy right after him, no, not even close. He was terrible. So pagan rulers pretty much opposed Christianity for just a number of reasons. They really did not like the Christians. They thought they were bad citizens. They were enemies of society, and that they were going to bring down the emperor and turn life into chaos. That's how bad they thought the Christians were in the Roman Empire. Because they refused to obey certain laws, and they refused to sacrifice to the gods. That was the big thing. So Origen writes a lot about the Christians being tyrannized by the devil, which is the emperor, whatever emperor was in while he was writing. And that all persons and all laws that are hostile to Christians are demon-inspired. That was his idea. So now, there's Philip right there. There's a bust of Philip. So here's the difference between pagans and Christians. This is very basic. The pagans made their allegiance to the ruler first, then to the gods. And in reality, they may have seemed to worship different gods, but they actually believed in one divine source of all the gods. So it might seem that they were worshiping all different kinds of gods, but actually their idea was that there really was one in charge of all of that. Because daemons are nature spirits. They make everything grow. Okay? And they're spiritual energies. And the pagans were very bound to the land and to their family, and they believed that everything was sacred. Christians, God first, then the ruler. Culture, family, doesn't matter, the land, who cares? They turn the word daemons into demons. So daemons is Greek for spiritual energies, and the Christians turn this word daemons into demons. That's where we get the word demons from. Okay, now, Celsus. He did a comprehensive criticism of Christianity, big one. This is the first time anybody wrote anything against Christianity. So this is 140, so middle of the 2nd century. He is described as a religiously inclined pagan Greek Platonist philosopher. So he's got a lot going on there. I think, is this the picture with his nose missing? Mm-hmm. Yeah, half his nose is missing on that bust. I couldn't really find it in a painting or anything, but they don't even really know anything about this guy except what they found from Origen. Because Origen is tasked with refuting this, but not until 70 years later. But they do know that Celsus was alive, and he wrote this, The True Word, which was the criticism of Christianity. He was alive during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, which began in 161. So they think he wrote this in 170. They're actually not really sure. He said that Christianity was a threat to the entire Roman Empire. Threat, completely a threat, and to society in general. They really did not like him. He says God is good. And evil does not come from God. It's not caused by God. God's not doing anything bad. He said the Christian message was extremely dangerous because even though they were claiming monotheism, they talked about two powers, God and Satan. And that they were not truly monotheistic. And that this is a human invention and there is only one power in the universe. What does that sound like? I've heard that before somewhere. He says Christians were showing their greatest ignorance in making up a being opposed to God and calling him the devil. And he charges them with blasphemy for their belief in this other power called the devil. There are no original texts or copies of the True Word, because the only reason we even know what we know about it is because when Origen wrote about it, he had a copy and he quoted Celsus liberally. So we know what Celsus actually said. So Origen wrote a thing called Contra Celsum, which means against Celsus. When I say that, I want to say contraceptive. Just wants to pop right out. Contra Celsum. So this is what Celsus wrote. He said, "It is blasphemy to say the greatest God has an adversary who constrains God's capacity to do good." Makes sense to us, right? Makes sense to me completely. I like this Celsus guy. It's Pope Clement that I really don't like. And this guy's great. Because he's really pointing out the foibles of what the Christian priests and everybody was teaching at the time to the people. So they're believing that stuff, that there is Satan against God and that they're rivals somehow. And he's really outraged about what the Christians are actually teaching and what they're claiming. And he says the Christians have created this rebellion in heaven with Satan and all of that to actually justify the rebellion on earth that they're talking about. And this is I think Celsus has a sense of humor. I laughed out loud when I read this part. She says that Celsus in his book, of course, which comes from Origen, and he's writing about what Celsus is saying. He says that Celsus was ridiculing Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, in which he said, if you might remember, you cannot eat anything that's been offered to the gods, lest you are in communion with the daemons, or the demons, right? Well, and of course, this word daemons means spiritual energy. Remember, it was turned into demons by the Christians. So, Celsus says, since daemons are the forces that actually energize all natural processes, which means growth of everything on the planet, by the nature spirits, right? Christians cannot really eat anything ever, because if they do that, they're going to be participating in communion with the demons. So I'm sorry, Christians, you're not allowed to eat anything. I thought that was a very astute observation. I laughed out loud when I read that. I was like, oh, he's sticking it to you guys, come on. Right? Natural processes, food, nature spirits. No, you can't eat anything now. And Origen preached that if you are constrained by an evil government, that you have every right to disobey, revolt, and assassinate the leaders. And this comes from the Christians being rooted in the fact that they are God's people. And because of baptism, which became very important, they have become citizens of heaven. And therefore, they do not have to follow any rules out here. Because we're better than everyone, and we don't have to do that. So 100 years after the Gospels have been written, you still have God's people versus Satan's people. I say the word Satan loosely. So interesting. Anybody got any questions? So those are Christians against the pagans. Now we get to go to the Christians demonizing other Christians.
That still goes on.
Hmm?
That still goes on.
Well, of course. I never said this was over. I never said we were in a better place.
That's the comment, that's all.
Yes, you are correct. Yes, we'll just leave that over there. Something I could say, but I am not going to say it. Okay, so now we are going on. Okay, baptism. You must be baptized or you are not a true Christian. Boy, they just get rules right away. You know? And look at this. Baptism gives you the Spirit of God. I read that and I went, that's dumb. You can't be alive unless you've got the Spirit of God. It has nothing to do with getting baptized. I mean, what's that spark in your eye? It is a spiritual spark of God. And when you leave your body, that spark is gone. Because you've left this body on the ground or wherever you were sitting or whatever you were doing. You're gone. But it says it washes away your sins. And now the poor little people have to learn, what's a sin? What am I doing? What's sin? Expels evil spirits because it assumes you've got evil spirits in there. Right? And that you can't even have the Spirit of God until you get baptized. Like pour water over your head and I say some words. Now you're cooking. They found baptismal fonts in the catacombs, so they know that the early Christians were actually, well, this is not even early, this is even later. This is 2nd century. They're hiding from the Romans in the catacombs, and they're baptizing people in the catacombs because they actually found, here's a couple of, this is one of those things that's little tiles, tiny little tiles that make that up, that picture. There's a guy in the baptismal font. And see, he's in the font, and he's got a halo on his head. The guy during the baptism has a halo. This guy, this little altar guy, he doesn't get a halo. I don't know why. But these other two guys do. Maybe he hasn't, I know he hasn't been baptized yet. But if he hasn't been baptized yet, what is he doing there? To be an altar boy, you have to at least be a Christian, right? You have to be baptized. I have no idea what they are not paying attention. Okay, so here's a guy. This is a painting. He's getting baptized, right? He's got a halo. Nobody else does. He doesn't even get one, that guy. So I guess it depends on whoever's painting and whatever their idea of what a Christian really means. So different Christian groups completely interpreted the Gospels in the old way they wanted to, and they were always arguing with each other. They dreaded Satan's attack from outside the community, of course, but actually that Satan is the intimate enemy, not way out there, but it's always other. Now it becomes other Christians within their now Christian community. They're not even talking about the Jews anymore. Now they're going after each other. So, Christian authorities. Well, I put Jesus there, and then after I did it, I laughed and I said, no, he wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew, remember? You learned that when you were 35. So, but when Jesus was on the planet, what he was saying with authority was what people, certainly, people were physically in his presence and learning from him directly. And then Peter, later on, becomes the first Christian pope, bishop, or whatever, in Rome. He's not even in Israel anymore. He's in Rome now. And then Paul founded a lot of churches, Greece and Turkey, around that area there. And so they were considered authorities at the time that they were preaching. Okay, here comes the guy I really don't like. Clement. He was either the second or the third bishop of Rome after Peter. He was not happy with the people in the churches who did not accept the authority of the local priest. He claims that if you do not believe in the authority of the local priest, that you are initiating, and these are his words, a horrible and unholy rebellion within the church. It's like, no. People did not like the distinction between the clergy and the laity. The laity being just the everyday person. Kind of like back in Jerusalem, where you've got Sadducees and Pharisees over here, and then you got us, the regular people. There was always a fight there also. So Clement, when I read what he's done, and I'm going to tell you that here in just a second, the first words out of my mouth were, oh my God, Clement was a gaslighter. He's gaslighting everybody by lying. It's like, a gaslighter will say, well, the moon is orange. And you go, no, the moon looks kind of, I don't know what color that is. No, it's orange. No, it's orange. No, it's really orange. You say it enough and people believe it. Okay? So Clement uses Isaiah chapter 60 when it says, I will make your overseers peace and your taskmasters righteousness. He interprets the two key terms, overseers and taskmasters, okay, that's hard to say, taskmasters, into bishops and deacons, because he translated into Greek to suit his argument, and he said, priests are divinely ordained because of what Isaiah said. And the little people, they're like, oh, okay, because they can't read. They can't read the Hebrew, Old Testament. They can't read anything. So when Clement tells them this, the illiterate people are like, okay, we accept the authority of the priest based on what you were saying about Isaiah. Okay. So they're saying that they were divinely ordained. Well, I guess if I was just a little person back then, I'm not going to fight it. What do I know? Who am I, right? So his solution to the problem? Submit to the priest and do your penance for being disobedient. So all the people are doing all that. They're saying, 10 Our Fathers and 50 Hail Marys at the, communion line here. Because they were really serious about making everybody toe the line. Well, if that wasn't enough, Clement starts the Apostolic Fathers of the Church. So this is Ignatius, Polycarp, and Clement. I always think of Polycarp as being many fishes. That's his Indian name, many fishes. Many carps, polycarps, right? There's actually 9 of them. I just put 3 up here. This group was formed to keep people in line, okay, by pushing the authority of the clergy and telling them that they had to adhere to all the moral codes that they were going to lay out. It is sort of thought that the 9 guys on this panel here of Apostolic Fathers, that some of them were somehow directly connected to the apostles, which meant the apostles were like 1,000 years old. So I don't know if that's really, but see, they call themselves the Apostolic Fathers for a reason, because they wanted to show that apostolic succession. And then, now the letter of Barnabas, this is really a piece of work. The letter of Barnabas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Barnabas. The main message of this, okay, written somewhere between 70 and 132. So John and Luke are like, in 80, 90 there, 100 maybe even. This comes out. And the main message of this is that the Jews got it wrong. The Jewish scriptures, which will become the Old Testament in Christianity, right? The Hebrew scripture becomes Old Testament for Christians. They were actually Christian documents from the beginning. That's what this Barnabas letter is all about. And he says that the Jewish people misinterpreted their own laws. They misinterpreted everything because actually the only thing that you need to know is the two ways, the way of light and the way of darkness. And she says that this gospel of Barnabas and the way it was laid out with the moral codes would dominate Christian philosophy and teachings for generations, especially about abortion and homosexuality. It's this Barnabas character that started all that falderall there. So if you want to get mad at somebody, go after Barnabas. I just thought that was fascinating, actually. Okay, now there's an actual copy of the letter of Barnabas. Now, them saying they know exactly what it said, I'm going, there's a little bit of redaction going on in there. Can't even see it. How do they know? How do they finish a sentence? How do they really know? And this is of course, this is a painting. This looks Greek. It could be Egyptian. I don't really know. Maybe Greek. But there he is right there holding his epistle. So anyway, I thought that was funny. They're saying everything that's in it, but yet they showed the actual copy of the first page and like, how do you know? Really? It kind of makes my ears go like the dog hearing a funny noise. It's like, are you kidding? Really? Okay, so now we get to Irenaeus. All right. He's now coming up into the 3rd century here a little bit. He claimed apostolic succession when he was in France. He's a Greek. He's a Greek bishop. And he actually was known for his development of Christian theology while he's combating Gnosticism all this time. And he's like really against heresy. So his whole focus was about heresy. That's all he cared about, was everybody committing heresy. So he decides to write a 5-volume attack called Against Heresies. 5 volumes. I mean, there were probably like 500 pages apiece. They're just writing all this stuff about all the heretics that are going on. So the word heresy in Greek actually means choice. So the heretics are people who are choosing a little bit of a different way, and they're calling that heretical. They even were saying that heretics lure people in the name of Jesus, and then they teach them doctrines that are inspired by Satan. That they're consciously doing this. So here's a picture of Athanasius of Alexandria. He's an interesting character. Over to the right, those are the codices from Nag Hammadi when they found them in 1945, and they're like caked with dirt. They're leather bound, but this is what they kind of looked like when they took them out of the ground, out of the jar, right? Now, how did these writings get inside the jar in Upper Egypt? I'm glad you asked, because I know how. I know exactly how. This guy right here, he sends out a letter at Easter time in 367 condemning the use of non-canonical books, which of course canon means it's in, we as the church fathers, we put it in the New Testament. If it's not in there, you don't get to read it. So what he does is he buries everything he can find in the jar, in the ground, in Upper Egypt, in that place, in Nag Hammadi where they found them. So yeah, he buries them there. At least that's what they're thinking, but that doesn't mean that's really true. But they think he did it on purpose, of course, because he wanted to get them out of circulation. And I don't know if you know this, but when they would have to write something, or especially copy it, you've got a little monk, tons of monks right in the basement, and they've got their little wood thing, and they're sitting there, they've got a candle, they've got the thing over here, got their finger on the line, and they've got their little pen, their little ink well, and they're writing they're looking over here and they're writing a word and they're looking, moving, writing, and then sometimes they fall asleep and they wake up and the finger's actually over here. It's not where it was before, and they missed a whole line. Or they missed 5 lines, or a whole paragraph, because they are copying them by hand. So, actually Bart Ehrman gives a very funny story how he teaches in his classes at UNC about how we even got any copies of anything. And that is just his funny story about how their finger just sort of moved because they sort of nodded out and they missed a whole line. So there's stuff missing. Actually, Bart Ehrman says there is no copy of any gospel. There's a little piece about this big that they think is John. Carbon date says it's John. He says there are no original copies of anything. So like I always like to say, they just make up. They just make stuff up. So here are some heretical works that were suppressed by the bishops. The Testimony of Truth. Okay? That is talking about that the Christians have actually fallen into moral error by following the apostolic fathers. So you know that's why it's in the jar. Right? Don't you dare say anything about the apostolic fathers. They're the true guys. They say, in this one, they say, renunciation is essential for every true Christian. The reality of rulers says the human condition is due to enslavement to cosmic forces. So they kind of agree with the regular, above ground Christians, what they're saying. That Christians are under the spell of the rulers of darkness. Kind of the same. Now the Secret Book of John rewrites Genesis. You could have a whole class just on that. We're not really going to go into that, but I thought that was interesting. So the Secret Book of John actually rewrites Genesis. So remember this word Greek is for heritage. Heretic is choice. Well, now we get to Tertullian. Tertullian of Carthage is the guy that made up the Trinity, by the way, in case you were wondering. He made it up. It's his writings that do Father, Son, Holy Ghost. That was him. That was going into the 3rd century. See, 240. So 160 to 240. So early 3rd century, Tertullian is writing about Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Which basically means 3 gods, 3 gods, 3 gods in one. That's a commercial, right? Certs, yes! 3 gods in one! Thank you for sharing, Kathy. Yes, that's exactly where that came from. So, if any of you have ever taken the class from Marita, she will not teach the Trinity. She will not teach it in terms of God is Father, Son, Holy Ghost. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, you can say body, mind, spirit as a trinity of our lives, but Father, Son, Holy Ghost as 3 gods in one, no. Because it doesn't make any sense, really. So Tertullian came from Carthage. I had to look it up. So if you're looking at a map, and you got the boot of Italy here, Carthage is in Africa, right across from Italy. It's a seaport in Western Africa. So, but it's not too far from Rome, so not too hard for him to get there if he wants to. But he says that the true church agrees in doctrine, morals, and leadership. If you are not there, you are not a Christian. Does that sound familiar? If you don't believe this, you're not Jewish. Okay, so Tertullian is quoting from Paul, saying that everyone who's a Christian should speak and think the very same thing. Making choices is evil because it disrupts group unity. No one should ask any questions. A person who questions turns into a heretic. Well, that was me in 2nd grade. That was me. Now I understand why the Catholics were given a catechism. The Catholic Bible did not come out until 1952, the year I was born. So I once asked the nun in second grade, I'll never forget this. We're talking about Adam and Eve. And then she's going, Adam and Eve, they get kicked out of the garden, and then they have Cain and Abel, and then Cain and Abel get married. Sister Rosemary, I don't understand. If Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve are the only people on the planet, where do their wives come from? Oh my God, you would have thought that I had sprouted horns at that exact moment. She came up to me, grabbed my hand, and swatted the top of it with a 12-inch ruler, really hard. They don't tell us the answer to that. We don't know. And of course I'm going, well, what do you mean you don't know? I'm 7. What do you mean you don't know? I don't get, why don't you know? But if there's only Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, where did those women come from that they were supposed to marry? She's just so frustrated. She's turning 3 shades of purple and wanted to scream at me. And so I got a whack for being impertinent, and I got a spider on my chart. Yes, I did. I just had to show you that story because now I know where the catechism came from. Yes, Jim?
I wasn't in that class. What is a spider?
What's a spider? A spider.
Not a star.
A spider. I didn't get a star. I got a spider on my chart. A little hand-drawn black spider.
Oh,
Spider.
I missed that.
Yeah. So you got a star on your chart at the end of the day. If you there's big charts in the back of the room on the bulletin board. So if you did really well, you got a star. Well, I got a spider that day. She hand drew a black spider in the box. And my top of my hand really hurt.
How many spiders did you get in all? Just asking.
Well, you know me.
Yes, that's why I asked that
I
question.
think I got a lot of spiderios. I think I really did. But so I'm here reading about Tertullian, and I'm like going, I knew it. They didn't want us to ask any questions. They did not want anybody to interpret anything, because what they're saying is what you need to know, we're going to tell you. That's why there was a catechism. They did not want anyone to study the Bible separately, because they may come to the wrong conclusion. It's like, when I ask you for your opinion, I'll give it to you. That's pretty much it. So, he said the church has already interpreted all the scriptures, so there's nothing to discuss. And heretics certainly have no right to discuss the scripture because they're not Christian. They're not allowed. So don't listen to them. And he says heretical arguments are inspired by the devil. And so if you're really a true Christian, you're going to follow the faith, and you're going to follow the rule, and you're going to be obedient to the priests. Now, this is very important. Because when I read this, I was like, oh, Pagels, you're great. There's Tertullian right there. Jesus encouraged questions. Jesus, the person who they are supposedly at the top of a religion and preaching about, they don't even know anything about him. They believe in Jesus, but they don't believe Jesus. Jesus says, y'all know Matt 7:7, right? Ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be open to you. He's saying, ask questions, go deeper, figure it out. Now, Tertullian, his thoughts on that? This is a direct quote. Where will the end of seeking be? Here's another one. Here's his thoughts on Matt 7:7. Away with the one who is always seeking, for he never finds anything. For he is seeking where nothing can be found. Away with the one who is always knocking. I can just see his face all screwed up because he just thinks this is stupid. Away with the one who is always knocking, for he knocks where there is no one to open. Away with the one who is always asking, for he asks of no one who does not hear. No, he asks of one who does not hear. Really? No wonder Christianity is so screwed up. I'm just saying it the way it is. This Tertullian, his philosophy went forward many centuries, hundreds of years, about saying don't ask any questions. I mean, you figure the Jesus movement's been around for 2,000 years. 1952, that finally the Catholics get a Bible that they're allowed to read. 70 years ago, in the face of 2,000, or even 1,500. That's ridiculous. But their idea was, if you think too much, you're going to get it wrong, and we need to tell you what to think. So when I left home and went to college, I never went back. Because I just didn't buy it. That's just me. Pagel says actually that the heretical writings actually had a very limited appeal. It wasn't that all the Christians out there were freaking out about what they were reading, because they weren't reading anything. They were listening to what the priests told them. And because they were always under threat of hell, they had to be careful about what they were thinking and saying. Now, the less radical heretics it was the less radical heretics that actually bothered Tertullian and Irenaeus, because they were more threatening to the emerging clerical authorities. And like who? I thought you'd never ask. My friend Valentinus. He taught, it's called Valentinian Gnosticism, because it was his version. Okay, so he is from Egypt. You see 100 to 180. He goes to Rome, when he's 40 years old. Somehow that is the midlife crisis of all these Christian guys. They turn 40 and they're like, what does my life mean? What am I going to do? I have to go find myself. So here's Valentinus. He moves from Egypt. He goes to Rome. Well, they thought he was going to become a bishop because he was considered to be a genius and he was very eloquent in his speech. Well, but they chose somebody else. And he's like, well, okay, never mind. He accepted the authority of the church, and he participated completely. Went to Mass, did baptism. Well, he eventually has his own spiritual awakening because he was really a sincere seeker. And so he became his own spiritual teacher, and then he got followers. So all of his followers looked like and appeared that they were just as strict as Tertullian and Irenaeus were. So it was hard to find the heresy in that. And he had very many followers that throughout the whole Christian world, and the people who followed Valentinus were the educated people because they read about Gnosticism. They read about what he was saying. They heard him when he said, go within, question everything. Total opposite of what the church fathers were saying at the time. Look for the deeper meaning. He wants you to go from faith. Don't just build your life and your faith in God on faith, but go to understanding, which makes you spiritually mature. Is to understand what you're reading, understand what you're feeling, understand your meditations, and find God within yourself. And he used the phrase Mother God, Mother Father God, which I thought was interesting. And seeing God as source, not God in heaven, sitting on a big throne with a book and a pen, writing down your sins. That is not the God of Valentinus. But of course, teachings they considered to be blasphemy at the time. And this word, of course, gnosis, means insight or wisdom, which means it comes from in here. And he was talking about that you reach your spiritual potential by developing that personal relationship with the Christ within. It's between you and God. And that we each find gnosis within ourselves, and it doesn't come from a book. So, basically, Valentinus says exploration is important to spiritual development. Irenaeus and Tertullian say, no, it's not. The church teaches you everything you need to know. So this was quite explosive. And Valentinus' ideas actually divided the Christian community at the time, when he was in Rome. Now, of course, Valentinus, his works were supposedly his works. Not sure if they're really his. In Nag Hammadi, there is the Gospel of Truth, and there is the Gospel of Philip. So the Gospel of Truth actually addresses salvation through gnosis, right? your inner exploration of God. And the Gospel of Philip, interestingly enough, addresses the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Don't know if any of you have ever heard of that before. Yeah, Jesus and Mary Mags were married, according to this. In the Gospel of Philip, it also says, she shares with us that Satan is never mentioned in the Gospel of Philip. He says it's not good to judge people because people are all different. Don't judge a thing good or bad. Just people are different. He doesn't blame any sins on Satan or any kind of activities that we do. And he said there's always a potential for humans to, commit evil, weird acts. But you simply have to root that out and know the truth. What does that sound like? Okay. So I'm telling you, I like this Valentinus guy. He might not have written that stuff. We don't actually really know. So, for spiritual formation within Christianity, the Gnostic Christians are saying it's through inner knowing and through agape, which is Greek for the word love. They also embrace the pagan idea, which is do what you will, harming none, including yourself. If you lived your life by that one little idea, it would be so easy. That's like a philosophy in a nutshell right there. Do what you will, harming none, including self. Because if what you choose to do doesn't harm anyone else, then we're saying, and it's good, then that will be God's will for you. Everything that's good is God's will. Traditional Christians, no. Contest between good and evil, they're still harping in on that. Now, I have not been to a traditional Christian church in many, many years. I used to go to Mass. I used to take my mother to Mass when I would go visit her. But I didn't really like it because it sounded like a bunch of parrots. Always, like the whole hour, parroting back all the different prayers. I thought, are they really thinking about it? And you do it every time you go to Mass. So and it says a lot. And they're all reading it from their book. And, I would like to see something a little more organic happening. So I don't really know what traditional Christians are even doing these days. And if they're still hooked on this good and evil thing. I don't even know. I mean, because I don't know who in here goes to like a traditional Christian church. Or when was the last time you were in one? So if anybody would like to enlighten us on that, I'll take that. No, nobody. I see everybody has moved past that, or you don't want to share, and that's okay. So, but this is from Pagels' book when it was written that Christian churches were still preaching that stuff. So now, of course, Irenaeus is announcing that Valentinian philosophy is as Satan's own inspiration. That's where it came from. So now Irenaeus has to get into the action, and he writes a book. So he's writing a book against heresies, and it was written specifically to counter the Valentinian beliefs. And this is a book cover, actually. Of course, his original manuscript did not look like this. I'm pretty sure this is probably from Simon & Schuster or someone. But Irenaeus says the Valentinians, all of them are agents of Satan, and they're going to end up in God's eternal fire. Where does it say anywhere about God having an eternal fire? Doesn't say that in the Bible anywhere. There is no fire. There is no terrible, horrible, whatever. There's no Satan with horns. The word Gehenna in Hebrew from Old Testament.
Aramaic too.
Oh, in Aramaic, same word. It really just means the trash pit, like the landfill outside of town. And anybody that lived there were living in hell, literally, because it smelled bad, it was hot, it was stinky, it was terrible. That's what they put everybody's trash. So that's what but they took this word hell and gave it a whole new meaning. I thought hell was in the middle of the earth and heaven was in its clouds. That's why you had to have wings, because you can't walk anywhere. Right? Everybody has to have wings in heaven because you can't walk. You fall right through the clouds. And that Satan and all that stuff was in the middle of the earth. That's where it was hot. So, but this whole idea of hot and hell and all of that hotness does not exist. They made it up. Now Athanasius gets in he gets into writing another thing. So that was Irenaeus. Now this is Athanasius. We talked about him already. He's the one that buried everything in Najamity. Now he gets in the act and he decides to write a book about the life of Anthony. Saint Anthony. Okay? His life actually influenced the development of the monasteries for the men to live in. So, this is Anthony. We already saw a picture of Athanasius. You don't need to see him again. Around 360, we think he wrote this. Athanasius wrote it, and Anthony lived right there, 3rd, 4th century. He memorized the entire Bible, okay? He gave away everything he possessed, and his family was very wealthy. He just gave it all away. And his life, as you can see over here, if you can really see this picture well, this is Anthony in the middle, and there's all these demons. And here's one that looks like, personally, like a fish. And they've got the bat wings and all kinds of stuff. And then here he is, gesticulating in some way, and then there is like sort of a still picture of him. So his big deal was, this is so crazy, he taught people to picture the most intimate enemy as yourself. Now it's not anybody out there, it's you. You are the most intimate enemy because your mind is full of the demons, full of the devil. Just like what the old Christian guy was teaching Justin Martyr, right? That human beings are essentially evil and bad. And I'm thinking that probably comes from, people's belief in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, by Adam and Eve, and all that whole falderall with Eve and the apple and all that. So there's a whole other book that she wrote on that. So I might do Adam and Eve. I might do Adam and Eve and the serpent one of these days too. But yeah, he was telling people to picture the most intimate enemy as yourself, as you. So can you imagine what that does to people's psyche? When they're just trying to learn about God and somebody's telling you, oh, you're evil. You're pure evil. You are the enemy of yourself. And Satan is tempting you to sin all the time. And because you have this demon mind, you're going to just do it. He also practiced terrible forms of self-denial and penance. Okay, he wore a hair shirt. You get your hair cut. One little piece of hair falls down here. You cannot get it out of there for anything. You got to run in your bathroom, rip off all your clothes, get a towel, get paint, powder. You got to get that one tiny little hair out of there, right? You just can't stand it. So can you imagine wearing a shirt made out of hair? I'm thinking, was it long sleeve or was it sleeveless? You get any break there in any part of your body. He never washed. Ew. They say the prophets in the Old Testament didn't either. And they did weird stuff like that.
Take a bath in sand.
Right, take a bath in sand. You can actually wash out a cast iron skillet in sand. I've done it. It works really well. As long as the dog hasn't peed there, you're good. So, he never washed. He wore a hair shirt. And he ate bread and salt only and drank water for his whole life. So he was like the epitome of that monastic life where you've got to, you have to suffer for God. You have to suffer for Jesus. And so somewhere along there in the Middle Ages, remember those guys that tied the silk, what's it called, a sulcus, something, around their leg and to make it bleed? And that was your oh, if you watched Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, there's a part in there, like for penance. So that you tighten that thing around your leg, tighten it until you bleed, and you have to wear it. And then the self-flagellation with the cat of nine tails. I mean, it's like, when I think of that, I'm like, oh man, I would never become a Christian. That's awful. That's terrible. Just the thought of like you're just doing all those things to your body. If you talk about your body as being, the temple of God, that God lives in there and around there. And that we are children of God. Why would you do that? So that's where monastic life actually came from, was from a lot of Anthony's life. And of course we find, and they call him Saint Anthony because people who do bad things to themselves are praised within Christianity. Like, you can't be sainted unless you've just really almost tried to kill yourself. So there are things in their lives that are just kind of make you wonder. Okay, so now I'm just going to make a little bit of a conclusion here. I put in the word cosmic war in the Google search box. I'd still be sitting there today looking at the pictures. And this was like 3 weeks ago. Because there are so many people's drawings and paintings about this idea of cosmic war. So in conclusion, you see sons of lightness, sons of light, and sons of dark. Okay, so if you really could see this really well, you see these angel people have black wings and a knife, and the people that they're stabbing all have the halos around them. So those are like the Christians, and these are like the bad angel people who are doing that. So that's a view of what cosmic war, what that was considered to be. And she just wants to remind us that each gospel in its own way invokes apocalyptic scenarios to characterize the conflict between Jesus' followers and all the different groups that each author perceived as the opponent at the time of the writing. So it's in their own lifetime that they are writing about Jesus' lifetime. And then, of course, we know the Jewish storytellers had the Satan, which was God's helper. He was helping him, like in the story of Balaam, that he sent the messenger to Balaam in order to save him from being killed. Now, along in the 5th century here, we have Augustine of Hippo. Actually, St. Augustine, that's St. Augustine, and the town, St. Augustine in Florida, is named for him. Of course, the first Christian Mass, well, so that would make it Catholic, the first Catholic Mass was said on a certain site right in St. Augustine. I've actually been there. And they have a really great store that has all the statues and all the rosaries and, all the fun stuff. So Augustine of Hippo, he was an Orthodox Christian. He did not like that languaging of Satan. He said it doesn't exist. Stop with the Satan and the evil. He wants to keep Christians monotheistic by not believing in a second power. It's interesting because a friend of mine said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're doing that Satan thing." In November, I said, "That Satan thing?" She goes, "We're going to talk about Satan." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Are you coming?" "No." I said, "Okay, that's fine." She goes, "But I'm really glad you're doing it." She said, because I work with these 2 ladies, and they invoke Satan all day long. I said, "People still do that?" She goes, "All the time. Everything that goes wrong in the office, Satan did it." I said, "You're teasing me, right? You're kidding." She goes, "No." She was so earnest and so sincere. She goes, "Well, I just really don't like it. I don't like being around them because it's just so negative." I said, "Well, I can understand that." I said, "You need a new job, honey." I can't imagine being around people who are doing that. It's just like, I'd lose my job. Because you know me, the mouth of the South, I would definitely say something. So they would fire me right away. But she said, yes, even today, blame everything on Satan. But Augustine, he's trying to get them away from that. Now this is 5th century. He's trying to get them away from talking about that and to understand Christianity is truly monotheistic because we only believe in God the good. Well, I'm afraid that they didn't really listen to him because that is not what is even happening today in many places. So now I promised you Martin Luther. Here he is. Okay. Now this is what he's doing. He denounces as agents of Satan all Christians who remain faithful to the Catholic Church, all Jews who refuse to accept Jesus as the Messiah, and all Protestant Christians who aren't his followers. Now, who does that sound like? Everybody else in history. Same. Same. It's frustrating when you read history and see that it's repeating itself constantly. You know, from the Old Testament to the New Testament to the Jews through the Christians, and then through the early middle Christians and the later Christians, they're all doing it. And I find that to be distressing because they don't believe Jesus. They believe in Jesus, but they don't believe him because they're not preaching what he says. They're making it up as they go along. Jesus did not follow Lent. He was a Jew. The Jews did not have Lent. It's not part of Jewish law. I asked somebody once about Lent, and they said, well, you know, Jesus established Lent. I'm like, no, what? No. So the church fathers made all of this up to get all the Christian people all on the same page. They made up rituals. They made it all up. The main thing is really, for each individual, is gnosis, your relationship with God. This is what matters. This is what matters. Nobody can take that away from you. No one can legislate that, although they may try. They definitely may try. Now, it's interesting to note that, now this is him posting his 95, what are they called? It's a thesis. He has 95 things that you're supposed to follow. 95 of them. So now he's laying down the law. But he's still not a Lutheran. He's still a Catholic priest. But now he's laying down the law for his followers. It's interesting to note that the Muslims say that Christians are allies of the great Satan. Who else, right? That's us. So we're all the great Satan to the Muslims. It really amazed me that the Crusades lasted 500 years. 500 years. Robin of Locksley was fighting the Muslims. Robin Hood, right? Robin of Locksley's Robin Hood. The first scene in that movie with Kevin Costner, he's got all this big hair and all of his friends, and they're in a dungeon, and they're all tied up, and they're going to cut his back. You know, they're trying to escape. It was probably like that, I mean, because the Muslims really hated the Christians. So, but I digress. So, she says that there are many religious people today who really no longer believe in Satan. They just don't. But she says that nevertheless, Satan has influenced everything about our culture and the legacy that we have when we perceive a social or political conflict where you've got the forces of good contending against the forces of evil. Even though you don't believe in Satan, there's still this idea, forces for good, forces for evil. And she said that it comes from early Christianity. Remember that the Jewish storytellers were still talking about the Satan, but by the time it really gets going, it's in early Christianity. She said there were some writers from the 1st century through St. Francis, 13th century, into Martin Luther King in the 21st century, who did not demonize their opponents. But they actually would risk their lives at the same time that they were praying for those opponents and trying to get reconciliation. And she said there's a basic struggle within Christianity and Christian tradition that's about that very idea of other, struggling with the idea of Jesus and reconciliation being divine. So what are they doing? They're not believing Jesus, they're believing in Jesus. But you have to do all of that in order to actually be saved. But do they believe Jesus? That's the question. And that's the whole thing with Pagel saying that, when you read Matt 7:7, Tertullian saying, no questions, no. He's not teaching what Jesus taught. So the old way of thinking is that the sons of darkness are not redeemable. Other, not redeemable. But Jesus would say, yes, they are through love. Yes, through love. She says the origin of Satan, her book, is an attempt to describe the evolving shape of the devil in the Judeo-Christian literature and the rise of demonization, a practice that has haunted Christianity for over 2,000 years of history. And here's a direct quote in an interview. The book is a meditation on the issue of how we perceive good and evil. For me, the book moves from a consideration of the social patterning about good and evil to an awareness of the individual's capacity for evil. And she says that demonization is a crucial and terrifying component of Christianity. And I think if you watched some televangelists today, you would find that. You would find that. And the last quote I'm going to give from Pagels is, what began as a minority sect's rhetorical strategy, that means very early Christians, which was a way of defining and asserting itself, meaning this small minority, became a majority religion's moral and even psychological justification for persecution. First the Jews, then the Romans, and then the heretics, of all opponents, real or imagined. And that is basically her last statement about that in her conclusion. So, what do you think? Any questions? Oh gosh, look! It's only 1:35. Yep, actually I really tried to make this within a time frame because Laurel says, if it's not over by 3, I'm leaving. I said, okay, I will make sure we are done long before that, so that you have plenty of time to get where you need to go. Probably The Walking Dead or something is on. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment, because you asked if there were any, what the traditional churches.
Mhm.
Of course, I've been to funeral services and generally that soft pedal, but sometimes there was a noise in heaven now and not in hell, because, and then there's the altar call, you know, at the end of some traditional services, funeral services. But I do come in contact with some people every couple of weeks
Yeah.
that do get the hell and damnation and Satan's real, and talk about this often. When they do that, I mean, I don't try to dissuade, change
Oh,
anything.
no.
Never ever try to touch it. You just say, oh yeah, I know Satan may be after, or they'll say Satan's after, but you know God's goodness prevails involved. We look to God.
Right.
Always.
Well, they don't want to hear that.
Well, they take it and go with it. You know, I haven't said anything bad about Satan.
That's good. No, don't disparage Satan. Oh my gosh, no.
People do, still believe.
Kate.
I was just with a friend yesterday.
Yeah.
I had snacks with her, and she's a Lutheran and very devout. And so her father died about 6 months ago, and so her mother is struggling with that. And there are all kinds of problems that her mother is having. And she said, I told Mama that the devil was not going to get her. The devil was going to take her. And I was just like, okay.
Excuse me for laughing, but that
Yes.
just made me burst out laughing.
So,
The devil was not going to get her, meaning what? Death is not coming?
all the problems that she had to deal with, she were arising because of the devil. So they were going to overcome all those problems by the light of God, and the devil was not
Not
going
going to get her.
to get her mother.
Well, if that makes her feel better, more the power to her. If you want to believe in Satan, if you want to believe in the devil and it works for you, okay. I'm not going to judge you for doing that, but it's not a historical, philosophical fact. It does not exist except in your own mind. That's where evil exists, is in people's mind. So now we've just heard Dr. Pagels, her view, and if you really, really want to understand the Bible, read Rocco Errico. any of his books. He's got the Aramaic light on every book in the Bible, and the Let There Be Light. And he talks about the 7 keys, which are those 7 things I told you about how to read the Bible and understand. Like that, the rock is coming 900 miles. Well, no, not even. It didn't roll itself even a mile. But it's an allegory. It's an idea. It's teaching a lesson. That's why any story in the Bible you can find could be for us, but it was never written to us. I mean, at least I don't remember being a Jew back then. I don't remember that. I could have been. I've been alive many times as well. I've been around many times. Somewhere doing something alive, and I could have been a Jew back then. I just don't remember. But I'll tell you, I would hate it. It sounds awful. It really does. It sounds just so hard to live in that time. And I certainly would not want to be illiterate. Oh my gosh. I'd want to get up in Clement's face for sure.
Dr. Erica also says all of the patriarchs, everyone, the voices we get from the Bible, and this is directly from the Peshitta, they were writing in their own time as they saw things.
Right.
And yes, they would have on this, they would see into the future. They were seers also.
Right.
And but they were writing about what things were happening, what was going to be happening if this stayed as it was, the consciousness of the people.
Right.
And so that's something else that I've taken consideration.
So Velma has actually been studying with Dr. Erko for quite a while in person because he has classes. He's still alive. Dr. Lamsa has been gone since 75. So, so when Dr. Erko was much younger, he was like the student following him around and getting his coffee and getting the manuscripts. Really, just like that old time. He's the tutor, you're the student.
Right.
Because I remember him telling a story about working with Dr. Lamsa. But boy, he just stuck with it, and now he has other people that he's teaching all this to, so that it doesn't die with Rocco Errico, because he's in his 80s now, right?
Yes, he is.
Right.
Yes.
So it's wonderful that other people are studying with him and that he has books, because otherwise you'd be throwing the Bible against the wall.
That's right.
And saying, I don't get it. This doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, he's online, of course, Zoom.
Right.
He speaks and does so many messages and teaches classes.
Right. So it's good. So, I chose this book because I thought it was so fascinating and interesting. I hope that you found the details of all of that fascinating and interesting. I know some of you read materials like this before, like Denise has read some other authors, and then Kathy was telling me about a couple of different ones. So I just found it interesting. I hope you did, and thank you all so much for coming today. You are so welcome.